13. Shakespeare's Heat. It was already late afternoon by the time Will and I decided to jump back to Stormsay. We'd spent hours questioning the characters in A Midsummer Night's Dream, but our efforts had met with little success. Only one character, the weaver who'd ended up with the donkey's head. Partway through the story, had reported seeing a hooded figure scurrying through the woods just before the summer had been stolen, though he wasn't entirely sure whether it had been the thief he'd seen or just a fairy. I was frustrated by our lack of progress. We urgently needed a more effective plan of action. Far from making things clearer, our foray into A Midsummer Night's Dream had just confused matters. Instead of catching the thief, I'd nearly got myself stabbed. And then there was the thing with Will, whose eye I'd been avoiding ever since the fog had lifted. Had he really kissed me out there in the dark? Our lips had touched so briefly, or had it just been my imagination? Just a product of the fairy magic that had given rise to such unlikely pairs of lovers, and had even made a fairy queen fall for a donkey? I felt another flutter in my chest when I remembered how close I'd been to Will. But at the same time, a horrible memory popped into my head, a memory that had been fighting its way to the surface with increasing persistence for the past few hours. The memory of a school trip. The others had been playing Truth or Dare one evening, and "You're jumping again," squealed Betsy the moment we landed on the mat in the stone circle. A second later, she was rushing over to Will, hugging him fiercely. "I knew it," she cried, ruffling his hair. "You've seen sense, at last." I stood up and took a few unsteady steps away from them. "You've been in the Jungle Book together, have you?" Glenn inquired. I gave a start. I hadn't seen him standing there. A gray monk's habit in a circle of gray stones was a perfect camouflage. "Yes, actually we were in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and—" "Not to worry," said Glenn, who was sitting on the one of the boulders with a thermos flask between his knees. Beside him were two used teacups. He and Betsy had clearly been waiting for us for quite some time. He smiled. "If Shakespeare is what it gets to get Will jumping again, that's fine by me." You're jumping again," sang Betsy. She'd taken both Will's hands and was trying to spin him around in a circle. We went along with it reluctantly, but stared over her shoulder the whole time, exhausted. I kept looking at his lips. On that school trip, Paul had asked for a dare, and Tamara had given him a simple task: kiss Amy. It was pretty easy as dares go, especially considering that his best friend Tom had just been made to eat half a lipstick. I hadn't exactly been mad keen to kiss Paul either, but the fact that he hadn't even been able to bring himself to do it, he'd shuddered in disgust and flatly refused. "Ew, not her," he'd shouted. "I'd rather eat the other half of the lipstick, please." The others had laughed and come up with a new dare for him. I'd gone to bed. At last Betsy released her hold on Will. She was out of breath but still beaming. "It's all sorted now, but you have to come up to the castle," she panted. "Your parents have been going mental at us on the phone for hours." "What?" Will exclaimed. All at once he was wide awake. "Apparently they heard about what happened to Holmes and they wanted to go and live with them on mainland," Glenn explained. "They're saying that if you're not jumping anymore anyway." "Really?" Will's face darkened. "Don't worry, my dad is fuming. He's already given them a piece of his mind," Betsy assured him. This only seemed to make Will angrier. "Let's go," he growled. "I'll talk to them." He stomped down the hill, Betsy following behind. Glenn, meanwhile, tucked the cups and the flask away in the folds of his robe and set back off towards the secret library. At last I stood alone in the middle of the stone circle, pressing the soft red leather bag of the Jungle Book against my chest. On the moor, the shapes of Betsy and Will grew smaller and smaller the closer they got to McAllister Castle. The wind blew in my face and brushed my lips, so much harsher and colder than Will's kiss. Assuming he had actually kissed me and it hadn't just been one of Puck's pranks. In my imagination, a gawky girl with a donkey's head and a red ponytail ran through a dark wood, and the boy she met did not realize because he had been enchanted by the juice of a magic flower. The McAllisters had always been proud of their warlike past, hence the suits of armor, helmets, and chainmail shirts lined up along the walls of the Knight's Hall. Behind them hung swords and flails and paintings of various battle scenes. The McAllister dragon stared out from every corner of the hall, keeping a watchful eye on proceedings. There was something menacing in its look. The family had once been famed for its bloodthirstiness, and the laird, regally ensconced in a huge armchair at one end of the room, still liked to remind people of this fact when he wished to intimidate them. Unfortunately for him, however, his brother and sister-in-law Aaron and Liza McAllister could not see him, and therefore had no idea how majestically he was holding the telephone. Will strode hurriedly across the hall and snatched the handset from the laird without a word. "Mom, Dad, what's up?" he asked. Will sobbed his mother on the other end of the phone. How are you? Fine, everything's fine. Really? Your mother is very worried about you, his father chimed in. They'd obviously put the phone on loudspeaker. We heard what happened. Was it just Will's imagination, or did his father's voice sound older than when they'd last spoken a few weeks earlier? He was reminded once again of how long it had been since he'd last seen them both. Will only visited his parents once a year at Christmas, and that was a while ago now. He only ever stayed for 2 days. He couldn't bear to stay longer. It hurt to spend too much time with the family he had lost. Will, are you still there? Asked his father. His mother was crying quietly in the background. Will sighed. I really am okay, he protested. What's wrong with you two all of a sudden? His father cleared his throat. Well, we want you to come and live with us on mainland, of course, as we always have. And now Sherlock's dead. We're very worried about you. Who knows what'll happen next? Come back to us, back to reality. Will sighed. His parents had been trying for years to persuade him to leave Stormsay, but he wouldn't, not ever. The book world is my reality. I can't just abandon it. How many times do I have to tell you that? And what happened with Holmes it wasn't an accident, his father broke in. No, thought Will. He had never for one moment believed Holmes' death to be an accident, but he was surprised to find that his parents were of the same opinion. How do you know? He asked. Brock wrote to me. He does that sometimes when he's feeling lonely, explained Will's mom. Brock doesn't know how to write. No, but I sent you a copy of his letter. Over a week ago now. Didn't you get it? Oh, right, stammered Will. No, the post gets mixed up here sometimes. He turned to the laird and held out his hand. His uncle tried to play the innocent, but it was clear from his face that he knew exactly what Will's mother was talking about. Will glared at the laird. Oh, yes, it's here. The letter was given to read by mistake, he said into the phone, still waving his open hand around the laird's nose. The laird smiled, but proceeded to rummage through the papers on the little table to his right, and eventually handed Will a crumpled sheet of paper. As he did so, he growled something about the clan's affairs and his right of head of the family to manage his correspondence. Will ignored him. He unfolded the sheet of paper and suddenly understood what his mother had meant. Brock had indeed written to her. It was just that the letter in the form of a picture, little more than a child's drawing, really, bright colors, wax crayons. As he looked at it, however, Will felt a chill run through him. He stared at the picture. For a moment he forgot about his parents that were still on the line. He forgot the laird or his ancient armchair throne. He even forgot Amy and their encounter in A Midsummer Night's Dream. In the middle of the paper was a picture of Holmes. He was lying in a pool of blood that flowed from a hole in his chest down to the bottom edge of the paper. A dagger floated in the air above him. Behind him stood the inhabitants of the island. Will recognized himself in the middle, kneeling on the ground, tears dripping from his face into the corpse. To his left stood Amy and her mother, hand in hand behind them. Glyn, Desmond, and Clyde in their monks' habits. They pulled their hoods up over their heads and stood huddled together as if in fear. Desmond looked the bravest of the three. He was stretching out his hand toward the dagger as if to take hold of it. To Will's right, Lady Merritt and Betsy could be seen whispering to each other. Behind them sat the laird in his wheelchair, grim-faced, and along the horizon danced a thin figure with a jam sandwich in his hand. The jam was the same color as the blood, and there, right in the foreground, in the corner of the picture, was another person seen from behind. The person was wearing blue dungarees, their hems stained red, was pointing a finger at the cluster of people as if to count them. Will swallowed hard. That wasn't how it had been. He and Amy had discovered the body on their own. None of the others had been there, had they? What had Brock seen? Will asked his mother. Will swallowed hard. There's something dangerous going on in Stormsay. You have to get away from here, do you hear? Come and live with us. Will's eyes were still riveted to the drawing in his hand. No, he said quietly. Please think about it. Will closed his eyes. He'd made this decision a long time ago. He'd been a child back then and had only guessed at what he now knew for certain. He belonged here. The world of stories needed him. I'm sorry. He hung up before his parents could say another word. Very good, murmured the laird as Will handed back the phone. You are a true McAllister. Will shrugged, folded up Brock's drawing, and tucked it in his trouser pocket and left the castle. He strode swiftly out into the moor. It was already dusk, and his cottage came into view. Will could see it only in outline. It sat crouched in its hollow waiting for him. This was his real home. He could feel it. Why couldn't his parents understand that? It was then, as he approached the cottage, that he spotted the shadow slipping through the bushes nearby. The ponytail looked familiar. Amy? I spun around and saw Will standing just a few feet away from me. I put a hasty finger to my lips. Will raised his eyebrows. What's going on? Said his eyes. I pointed to the open door of his cottage. Something was moving about inside. It was the half-starved child, helping herself, so it seemed, to Will's supplies. I'd seen the girl roaming around the grounds of Lennox's house and had followed her here. Will crouched down in the bushes beside me. What's she up to? He whispered. I think she's making herself another sandwich. He shook his head. There's nothing left to eat in there. What else could she be doing? No idea, but I'm sure I am curious to find out, murmured Will. Together we crept toward the cottage and edged across the threshold. The child didn't seem to notice us. She was hunched over the chest beside the sofa, scrawling about inside it. Her matted hair was spread out across her back like the fur of a wild animal. Are you looking for anything in particular? Asked Will. The little girl spun around, fear glinted in her eyes. She stared at us for a moment with the terror of a cornered rabbit. Then she took a deep breath and ran. Her bare feet thwacked against the floorboards as she dodged around the coffee table and came flying toward us. A moment later she dived through the middle of us. It happened far too quickly to be able to stop her. Will did step out in front of her, but she immediately ducked between his legs. I tried to hold her back too and grabbed at her dress. The material was fragile and it ripped when the little girl tugged at it. She'd soon fought her way past us and fled. We gave chase straight across the moor just like the last time, only this time she was turning in the opposite direction. The skinny little thing didn't make it easy for us. She was far more agile than we were and seemed to know her way around the island extremely well, better than Will even. We followed the child up to Shakespeare's seat. There, somewhere between the bushes and the edge of the cliff, we lost her. All of a sudden she was just gone, as if she'd vanished into thin air. What if she fell? I panted, peering over the precipice. The wind tugged at my jacket. Many meters below us, the sea thundered against the rock face. The cliffs were pretty high and pretty lethal. That much was certain. Let's hope she's just found a good hiding place, Will replied. What's that you've got there, anyway? He pointed at my right hand, in which I was still clasping the scrap of fabric from the child's dress. Now that I looked more closely at it, however, I saw it wasn't fabric at all, but paper. I crouched down and smoothed it out across my knee. The paper was old and dirty and charred at the edges. On the back was a curved line that looked as though it had been part of a letter. I was trying to grab hold of the little girl. I thought it was her dress. May I? I flinched as his hands touched mine. He picked up the scrap of paper and held it under the light of his flashlight. Looks old. I stood up again. As old as the remains of the burned manuscript? We looked at each other. What does this mean? I whispered. I don't know, said Will, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It's all so confusing. The thefts in the book world, Holmes' death, his child. Brock sent a letter to my parents. He saw Sherlock's body, too. He thinks somebody stabbed him. Who? Will shrugged and suddenly looked absolutely exhausted. A lock of hair had fallen into his face, and it took all my willpower not to tuck it to one side. I moved it a little farther away from him, just to be on the safe side. Will's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. And then that thing this afternoon in A Midsummer Night's Dream, he began, looking intently at me. A new kind of panic welled up inside me. Was he wondering what had come over him, what strange spell he'd been under? We haven't even had a chance to talk about that yet. I prepared myself for the inevitable rejection to come and stared down at my feet. I really couldn't face being snubbed again. Couldn't he just pretend nothing had happened? Oh, said Will. I didn't mean to upset you, Amy. I really thought you. My face felt hot. It's fine, I muttered. Puck's fog must have stopped both of us from thinking straight. Yes, he said quietly, turning away. Sorry. He looked out to the sea. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. The waves roared. It was almost dark by now, though nowhere near as dark as Puck's fog had been. Eventually, Will cleared his throat. If you ever change your mind, he said, his gaze still firmly fixed on the horizon, let me know, yeah? My heart skipped a beat. What? I stammered. Had I heard right? I felt dizzy, but I thought, because of the fog, I thought you kissed me by mistake. He was beside me in a heartbeat. His lips tasted of words, of hundreds, thousands, millions of words, and the stories hidden inside them. And they tasted of salt like the sea below us. This time, Will's kiss lasted longer, and it was different. This wasn't like the fog in A Midsummer Night's Dream. It was more real. Probably because this was the real world, the wind was still tugging at our clothes, but I didn't feel cold. I felt Will's body close to mine, warm. One hand was on my waist, the other buried in my hair. I felt for his shoulders, the gentle flutter in my chest had swollen to a hurricane, and the blood roared in my ears. This wasn't fiction, it was really happening. With this realization, all my anxieties melted away. You thought I kissed you this afternoon by mistake? Asked Will when we moved apart. His voice was hoarse, but he was grinning. I thought Puck had put a spell on you. Isn't that what happens in the story? People fall in love with each other because the fairies have cast spells on them? Will put his head to one side. Yes, that's true, but I liked you before that. Did you really not? He broke off. Something behind me had attracted his attention. There's somebody up at the stone circle, he cried as whirled around. The child? Somebody's jumping. See that light? The stone archways at the top of the hill were silhouetted against the night sky. It was too dark to see who was up there. There was indeed something glowing under one of the arches, something small and rectangular that looked as though it might be a book. Again we ran along the path that led down from Shakespeare's seat and across the fields. Luckily I wasn't far to the Porta Literae By the time we were close enough to have a clearer view of it, however, the light from the book's pages had disappeared. Instead, we saw somebody standing in the center of the stone circle. Somebody in a long coat with a hood pulled down. It was Lady Merritt. My mouth went dry. What was she doing here? We ducked down behind one of the boulders. My grandmother didn't seem to have realized we were there, pale-faced, shoulders quivering. She stood looking at the open book that lay just a few yards from her feet. Was Lady Merritt the thief? I hesitated to believe it. It had to be a misunderstanding, didn't it? She was too old to jump, after all, and yet what was she doing here? Rage sank its sharp claws into my stomach and burrowed in my guts. I wanted to run to her, shake her, and scream at her, but Will held me back. It won't do any good, he mouthed. I suspected he was right, so I contented myself with staring at my grandmother for the time being. A few strands of white hair had worked free of her usually so perfect hairdo, and she only had one earring on. Her lips were pressed tightly together in suspense. She appeared to be waiting for something or someone. And at that very moment the book lit up again, and I recognized the cover. It was a book of fairy tales, Betsy's book of fairy tales. A human body rose on the pages. A head of shiny blonde hair was the first thing to emerge, followed by a high forehead with perfectly plucked eyebrows. I gulped as Betsy appeared. She was wearing a long dark coat over a gray shift dress. She climbed elegantly out of the book and picked it up. Right, that's all of it, she said, handing Lady Merhead an empty string bag. Lady Merhead pocketed it nervously. Did anybody see you? Betsy sighed. No, of course not. I know what I'm doing. Good. My grandmother rubbed her upper arms to warm herself up. It's taken care of then, thank you. Betsy nodded and tucked the book into her coat pocket. They walked down the hill together, and Will and I followed him. When they finally parted without a word and hurried off in different directions, we split up too. Will went after Betsy, who seemed to be heading back to the castle. I tiptoed on after my grandmother. The whole way back I wondered what on earth this could mean. Was Betsy the thief? Was she the one destroying the literary world on my grandmother's orders? It hadn't looked as though Betsy had stolen anything. The string bag had been empty after all. But why had she been jumping at all at night? Why was it so important to my grandmother that nobody should see her? What was it that the two of them were hiding from the rest of the island? By the time we reached the grounds of Lennox's house, I could stand it no longer. I had to know what was going on. I appeared at Lady Merritt's side so suddenly that she stumbled and very nearly ended up in one of the geometrically trimmed hedges. Why was Betsy jumping just now? What are the two of you up to? I cried. My grandmother regained her balance and smoothed the skirt of her dress. Amy, you scared me half to death, she said. I had neither the time nor the inclination to apologize. Is it you stealing the ideas? Ideas? What was that just now at the stone circle? What's Betsy doing for you in the book world? Nothing you need concern yourself with, Amy. She tried to move past me, but I wouldn't let her. I don't believe you. I'm sorry, but I can't explain it to you. I don't understand. The book world is in danger, and you, Amy, said my grandmother, and there was an unaccustomed sharpness in her voice. The uncertainty she had shown just now up at the Port Literae had evaporated. I am the mistress of Lennox's house and the head of this family. Stormside and the literary world are my life. If I say something is none of your business, then it is none of your business. But why is Betsy jumping in secret? I persisted. That is between me and Betsy. She had my permission to jump tonight. But you can rest assured that everything in the book world is perfectly fine. I laughed out loud. I'm guessing you don't happen to have read Pride and Prejudice or A Midsummer Night's Dream recently, then? Glenn told me about Elizabeth Bennet's accident. Such things do happen, Amy, even in the literary world, but her leg will heal, and the story will return to normal again. The carriage only went into the ditch because the thief ran out in front of the horse. Nonsense. I snorted. And what about the fact that it's snowing in Athens? It's the first I've heard of it, said the lady. I shall ask Desmond what has been going on. The idea that the story is set in summer has been stolen. That's what's been going on. Lady Merhead frowned. If that is the case, it is a very serious matter. One which I shall look into. With that, she seemed to consider our conversation at an end. She managed to push past me at last, hurried up the front steps and into the entrance hall, but she wasn't getting out of it that easy. Which book was Betsy in just now? What was she doing there? Nothing, said my grandmother, taking off her coat. What was the bag for? Why are you afraid somebody might have seen her? Seen her doing what? You've been eavesdropping. I shrugged. Why won't you just answer my questions? Because none of this is any of your business. She glared at me. Listen, Betsy jumped with my permission. She is not going to do it again. What she was doing for me and why is no concern of yours. And now if you would please excuse me, it's late and I'm tired. Why, she sighed. Go to bed, Amy. You've got to be up early tomorrow, and you'll wake the entire household at this rate. She turned and disappeared down one of the corridors, leaving me standing there alone. The wound was fatal. He knew it. He had known it at once. Blood oozed from the hole in his chest. He watched the red river as if from afar. Watched the bright drops well up as if they did not concern him, as if the wound had nothing to do with him. as if it was not he who was dying but somebody else. Countless drops, one after another, running together to form a stream. Pulsing life that turned the world into a red sea. It was beautiful. It was the end. I have to go downstairs really quickly. 14. Ideas. When Werther, Will, and I entered the inkpot the next morning, we were prepared for the worst. We were fully expecting to hear that another theft had taken place overnight, but we heard nothing of the sort. Quite the opposite, in fact. An Arabian man, who came floating by the club on a flying carpet, informed us that the Sultan's treasure chamber had been miraculously refilled. For gold and jewels, a renewable resource in the book world, we waited a little longer for news, but apart from the landlord coming over to give Werther his post, a bulging envelope from his pen friend Wilhelm, nothing happened. Will and I returned to Stormsay around lunchtime. There was no sign of Glen or Betsy in the stone circle, but the clamor of voices drifted up to us from the foot of the hill. From the sounds of it, the laird was down there, and was not at all happy. There was a heated debate going on between him and Lady Marad, and there were other voices too. What on earth was going on? As fast as we could, we hurried down the path that led to the secret library. By the time we rounded the bend, the laird's head had gone so red that it looked as though he was about to shoot up out of his wheelchair into the sky and explode like a firework. My grandmother was marching to and fro outside the entrance of the cave, and Alexis was talking to Desmond and Clyde, and Betsy was arguing with Glenn something about security measures while Mr. Stevens attempted to pacify Lady Marad. Sitting a little way from them was Brock. He had his head cupped in his hands and was counting the blades of grass at his feet. "What's happened?" asked Will and I together. The laird yelled something that sounded like unbelievable and a catastrophe, but he was in such a rage that we couldn't really hear what he was saying. Lady Marad now began to pace up and down even more hurriedly than before, and I thought back to our encounter the previous day. Did all this commotion have anything to do with Betsy's secret jump? It was Desmond who finally explained to us what had happened. "The manuscript," he said, "has disappeared. Clyde and I realized just a few minutes ago that it was gone. Somebody has smashed the glass and stolen the paper fragments," he sighed. "They were all we had left of our home. They were a monument to the fragile truce between our families," said Lady Marad. "This must have been a threat. Whoever has taken them must be trying to provoke another war between the clans." She stared at the laird, who took this as a personal insult and completely lost it. His inarticulate bellows showered everything and everyone within a 2-meter radius with spit. I took a couple of steps backward, so the remains of the manuscript had vanished. Will shot me a glance and told me he was thinking the same thing I was. The child had been carrying a charred scrap of paper. Might she have made more than one? Might she have had more than one? My grandmother in turn started yelling at the laird, who was still ranting incoherently. Though none of us could really understand a word he said, it was fairly sure he was accusing our family of being behind the crime. Alexis stepped hastily between him and my grandmother and tried to keep the peace. "It'll turn up," she said, but she didn't stand a chance against the laird and Lady's expletive-ridden tirades. Eventually, the two adversaries must have decided to go and inspect the scene of the crime, because my grandmother disappeared suddenly into the library of the laird entered, and the laird ordered Desmond and Clyde to carry him down the stairs. Betsy, Alexis, and Mr. Stevens followed. Will and I looked at each other. Should we go down too? I asked. Will shrugged. Would there be any point? Well, I said, pondering, aside from the fact that we're pretty sure we already knew who the thief was. A few scraps of stolen paper were really the least of our worries right now, so no, I guess not. All of a sudden, Will grinned. Do you like pancakes? What? I blinked. Do you like pancakes? Yes, why? I could make you some. I mean, it looks like lessons are over for the day, and pancakes are my specialty. Your specialty? He moved closer to me and took my hands in his. Our fingers entwined, mainly because pasta and pancakes are the only two things I know how to make. He leaned forward as our foreheads were touching. But for you, I'll learn how to make a third dish, obviously, maybe even a fourth. Pancakes sound great. Good, said Will. We moved apart, but first I got a question for him. Him? I looked around. Only then did I realize that Brock hadn't gone down to the library with the others. He was still sitting in the glass, counting. Will went over to him, pulled a piece of paper out of his trouser pocket, and held it under his nose. What's this all about? He asked him. Why did you write to my mom? Brock didn't even look up. Why did you draw all these people? What do you know about what happened? Did you find Sherlock's body before we did? Will persisted. Brock carried on counting. His lips moved silently as his large hands parted the blades of grass. Brock? Will put the letter away and took it by the shoulders. Please, it's important. Tell me what you saw. But even when Will shook him, Brock pretended not to know he was there. At last he stopped counting and stood up and stomped across the moor. The blue of his dungarees shone bright against the leather as he moved farther and farther away. Half an hour later, Will and I arrived at the cottage. We'd had to make a detour into the village to buy a few supplies from Finley's. Now we were laden with paper bags containing milk, flour, sugar, eggs, pasta, and chocolate, and some fruit. I'll be right back. Brock carried on counting. His lips moved slightly as his large hands parted the blades of grass. Brock? Actually, I already read that part. Half an hour later, Will and I arrived at the cottage. We'd had to make a detour into the village to buy a few supplies from Finley's. Now we were laden with paper bags containing milk, flour, sugar, eggs, pasta, chocolate, and some fruit, as well as another loaf of bread and a jar of cherry jam. Together we unpacked it all, then Will made a pancake batter while I curled up in the corner of his sofa and watched him. So the little girl stole what was left of the manuscript. I mused aloud as Will cracked the eggs into a bowl. She probably thought it was pretty, said Will. I mean, I don't know what else anyone could want with those little scraps of paper. You can't even read the story anymore. There's not enough of it left. Hmm. Will whisked the ingredients together. Do you want apples in it? He asked. Yes, and I want us to find out who the little girl is and where she comes from. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was crucial. He nodded. Let's go and check out the old caves in the north coast this weekend. I still reckon that's where she's hiding. Deal. Will grinned at me and tossed the first pancake energetically into the air to flip it. I returned his smile and our eyes locked. At that moment, the half-finished pancake landed with a plop on the floor. Will gasped, embarrassed, and I couldn't suppress a giggle. I don't usually do that, he protested. You distracted me. What Will served up 10 minutes later was hot and sweet, a little burned and somewhat spongy around the edges, but it seemed to me the most delicious thing I'd ever eaten. Will came and sat down next to me, and we feasted on pancakes until we couldn't eat another bite. Then he stretched out his long legs contentedly, and I rested my head on his shoulder. He ran his head through my hair, sorry, hand through my hair. I breathed in his smell and couldn't believe this was real, that it was actually happening. Do you really mean me? I whispered. Of course, Will stroked my cheek with his thumb. You're the one that's stopping me from cooking properly and thinking straight, he murmured. Even if well, he swallowed hard. I still have nightmares about Holmes, horrible nightmares. Luckily, I can't usually remember them that well when I wake up. All I remember is that they were horrible and that my best friend is still dead. He cleared his throat. But at least that when it happens, all I have to do is picture your face and straight away I feel better. I smiled. Will turned his head to kiss me and caught sight of the solitary lock of hair behind his left ear, which, unlike the rest of his wild mane, was curly and usually lay hidden beneath the straight bits, a solitary curl on head of flyaway hair. I twiddled it around my finger and decided that this little curl was Will's cutest lock of hair, but I decided not to tell him that and lost myself in his gray blue eyes instead as we kissed. That afternoon on Will's sofa was like an island of light and warmth in the middle of a stormy sea. We both knew that these were stolen hours, that chaos still raged outside, but for a moment all of that faded into the background. We were happy that afternoon, despite the fact that somebody was destroying the book world, that Holmes had been killed, that a mysterious child was haunting the island, and that somebody had tried to stab me. We couldn't help it. We were in love. We kissed and read aloud to each other. We ate chocolate and talked about our childhoods. We marveled at my descriptions of our high-rise block of flats and Alexis's vegan diet, and I laughed at the picture Will painted of a younger, less embittered Laird playing in the sandpit with him and Betsy. I found the very idea that there had once been a sandpit on Stormsday rather surprising. Will, lying down low with his head on my lap, asked me to grab his photo album from the chest beside the sofa so he could show me the photographic evidence. I leaned down over the armrest because I was too lazy to stand up and because I didn't want to move even an inch away from Will. I stretched out my fingers a little farther, until they were almost touching the chest, and lost my balance. I fell from our island of happiness and landed roughly on the wooden floorboards of reality. Will tumbled off the sofa, too. I'd pulled him down with me. But as he laughed and got to his feet again, I lay there on the floor staring open-mouthed at what I'd discovered. They were under the sofa. They shimmered and shone in every color of the rainbow, and they emitted an almost imperceptible hum as if they were vibrating very softly. Or were they breathing? They appeared at first sight to be like glass spheres. 7 in all, each about the size of a walnut, lying clustered together on the floor in the corner and glowing amid the dust and cobwebs. A beautiful flower bloomed inside one of the spheres. A cyclone stormed and swirled at the center of another. Inside a third sat a white rabbit wearing a waistcoat and looking nervously at a pocket watch every few seconds. I swallowed hard. Could these be? Were they? Amy! Will was still laughing. He wound his arms around my waist and pulled me back onto the sofa. Are you okay? Did you hurt yourself? I shook my head. Will held the open photo album under my nose. Allow me to introduce Betsy, Amy, aged 2. Yes, Betsy really did play in the mud with me, and yes, we really did eat those sand cakes. He put an arm around my shoulder, and I pretended to look at his childhood photos, but I didn't really see a single one of them because the 7 glass spheres were still glinting in my mind's eye. Strange thoughts chased one another through my head. Later that evening, I lay on my bed in Linux House and scrolled through the library of my e-reader. Once I'd got over my initial shock, I'd left Will's cottage in a hurry. My plan had been to jump straight into the book world and look for evidence to disprove the terrible suspicion that was looking at the edges of my consciousness. Ever since my discovery of the cottage that afternoon, there was a thought at the back of my mind that I'd been trying not to let myself think, because I knew that if I did, it would tear me apart. In the end, however, I hadn't jumped, partly because I didn't even know where to start looking, but mainly because I was afraid I wouldn't find the evidence I needed. Instead, those terrible thoughts had been going round and round in my head all evening, and now I was utterly exhausted and in need of a story to distract myself with. I had to read a book right this minute and in the traditional way, or I was going to go completely insane. Preferably something nice and peaceful. I picked out a scene partway through Heidi. The sun was shining and Peter was driving his goats out to graze on the morning pasture. Heidi lay in the grass picking bunches of wildflowers and stroking the baby goats. I read several pages, word by word, sentence by sentence, with my feet on the bed and the pillow at my back, and that in itself was wonderful. I accompanied Heidi down to the mountain into the city, where she met her friend Clara and the strict Fraulein Rottenmeier. As I rejoiced with her when she was finally allowed to return to the mountains and to her beloved grandfather. It was fun reading like this. It felt familiar and comfortable, and I would have carried on a lot longer if I hadn't suddenly come across a line in the text that made me stop short. Had I really just read a sentence about a young man in silk stockings and a velvet waistcoat? I read on, and then the next paragraph I found something that definitely didn't belong there. "Miss Amy," came a whisper from the edge of the meadow. "It's important. Come quickly." I cast my eyes several times over these lines that seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with the text around them, lines with my name in it. There was only one person I knew who called me Miss Amy. When I realized who it was that was calling me, I slid the e-reader over my face with a sigh. I'd have to jump after all then. I still didn't really feel like it, but it didn't look as though I had much of a choice. In the blink of an eye, I found myself lying on the grass right in the middle of Peter's herd of goats. I was being snuffled at by a host of curious twitching noses. A little billy goat butted my thigh cheekily with its horns, and a nanny goat proceeded to chomp away at my ponytail. Werther pulled me to my feet. "At last," he cried. "Did you not see me waving just now behind Fraulein Rottenmeier's back?" No," I stammered. "What's up? Why were you—" "It's no matter," Werther cut in. "We must hurry if we are to get there in time." "Get where?" Werther dragged me down to the mountainside beside him, flicking us to the story's pages and down to the valley so fast it made my ears pop. "The thief is on the prowl once more," he explained as we went. "The fairies spotted him and alerted me. It looks as though he is headed for the metamorphosis." "The thief is metamorphosizing?" "No, the metamorphosis appears to be his next target. Don't dawdle so." I stumbled along behind him, still not understanding what he meant. I said inelegantly. "The thief is about to strike again." "In Metamorphosis by Kafka. Do you not know the book?" In my head I went back over all the books I'd read in school in the past few years. As Werther hustled me along a street into what looked like the early 20th century city, I dimly remembered a story about a man who wakes up one morning to find he has turned into a giant beetle overnight. Ew. Insects were my least favorite creatures of all time, especially when they were the size of people. But the thought that we might just beat the thief to it this time trumped my misgivings. Werther flicked hurriedly through the book until we came to a drab gray apartment, a small bedroom to be precise. It was narrow and old-fashioned. On the wall hung a picture of a lady in a fur coat, and in the bed a man lay sleeping. This must be Gregor Samsa, the main character of the story, though at a moment you couldn't really tell he was a man. A man who usually spent his days journeying from place to place as part of his job of a traveling salesman, because at the moment Gregor Samsa had the body of a giant black beetle. But he hadn't woken up yet. He didn't know anything about his metamorphosis. The story hadn't even started. I looked at the giant beetle under the covers. Its carapace shone blackly. Its antennae rested on the pillow, and its little legs stuck up in the air. A shiver ran down my spine at the sight of this monster. Poor Gregor Samsa. Werther, meanwhile, didn't even seem to be the beetle man lying in his bed. He leaned against the window and peered down the street. "He will be here soon," he murmured. "Soon." But I was no longer sure I really wanted the thief to fall into our trap. It very much depended on who he or she was. I took a few deep breaths and forced myself to focus on the here and now. "How do you know the thief wants to steal something from this particular point in the story?" I whispered, so as not to wake Gregor Samsa. "Well, what would you take for a metamorphosis if you were looking for initial ideas?" he asked, and answered his own question in the same breath. "Precisely, the metamorphosis itself. But he's already morphed into a beetle, I pointed to the monster. Werther, who was now pacing up and down the room, nodded. Because that's how the story starts. In truth, therefore, there is no unmorpho Gregor Samsa, but look, he ran a trembling fingertip over a spot on the beetle's head, which glowed faintly as he touched it. The idea of the insect body is just here. If we can prevent the thief from acquiring it. There was a rustling noise outside the bedroom door. Werther fell silent and put a finger to his lips. We listened. There was complete silence, but now Gregor Samsa opened his beetle eyes. For a while he gazed at his domed belly and his delicate little legs. Then he tried to turn on his side and kept rolling onto his rounded beetle back again. Eventually he looked at the alarm clock beside his bed, which showed as 6:45, and gave a start, perhaps because he had just spotted me and Werther standing across the room from him. His antennae swiveled toward us in surprise. Gregor, called a woman's voice from outside the door. It's 6:45. Don't you need to be going? Yes, Mother, thank you. I'm getting up now, replied Gregor Samsa in a harsh beetle voice, trying and failing to get out of bed. He just couldn't quite manage to tip himself onto his belly. The room had two other doors. Gregor's father could now be heard outside of them, and his sister Gret at the other. Both wanted to know why Gregor had not gone to work yet, and whether he was unwell. The little beetle legs paddled helplessly and ever more frantically through the air. There were knocks on all three of the bedroom doors. Should we help him up? Asked Werther. Werther shook his head firmly. No, we must not interfere with the plot, he said quietly, looking out of the window again. He seemed to think the thief was going to come marching down the street any second now. In fact, however, the thief must have come flicking through the pages of the story just as dexterously as we had. For a moment later, there was a cry from outside the door where Gregor's mother was standing. What do you think you're doing? Who are you? Shrieked Gregor's mother. What's going on? Demanded Gregor's father. Has something happened? Called Gret. Pull down that ridiculous hood and show yourself, ordered Gregor's mother. Ow, you're hurting me. What's the matter? Called Gregor's father. He pushed me out of the way. Who? The stranger. Werther and I held our breath as Gregor Samsa continued to rock laboriously to and fro on his back, trying to tip himself over the edge of the bed, and eventually landed with a dull thud on the carpet. Perhaps it's the chief clerk, called Gret. I think it would recognize the chief clerk if he were standing right in front of me. I thought he had his hood up. And? We heard Gregor's mother gasp. That is my son's bedroom. Kindly stop tampering with the lock. And now from our vantage point inside the room, we could still see the key being pushed very slowly out of the lock by somebody outside the door. It fell to the floor and landed on a strip of paper that hadn't been there a moment before. The thief pulled a piece of paper with the key on it out from under the door. Then we heard the lock click. The door handle turned. The door opened, with just a crack at first, and wider to reveal a black cloak. Werther pounced on the hooded figure the moment it set foot inside the room. At last I had to help him, of course. I leaped forward, too. This is the moment we've been waiting for so long. The thief had fallen into our trap. All we had to do now was grab hold of whoever it was and rip that stupid hood off their face. But what would we find underneath it? Did I really want to know the truth? But now I had begun to have great misgivings about the thief's identity. I hesitated mid-leap for a fraction of a second. I forgot about the way my feet were doing. I tripped over Gregor, who was lying on the floor and his legs were waving in the air, then collided with Werther and sent him flying too. We had lost the element of surprise. Before we could get back up, the thief had turned on his heel, shoved Gregor's mother aside once more, and flicked through the pages and away. It all happened so quickly that we didn't even see which way he went. Crap, I panted once I'd found my feet again. Werther, mopping the sweat from his brow and his embroidered handkerchief, nearly shrugged. I wouldn't say that, he said, cocking his chin at Gregor's head where the idea of the beetle body still shimmered. The thief had not succeeded in stealing it. We'd stopped him. Werther and I grinned at each other. We hadn't managed to catch the scumbag, but at least we'd saved metamorphosis, hadn't we? What if he comes back, I asked. I do not think he will try again here. Everybody is forewarned now, after all. He turned to Gregor's family, who had all come bursting into the bedroom and were staring down at the giant beetle. You must look after him and keep a very close eye on him from now on. The family nodded. They were all visibly shocked. And we have to think about what we're going to do next, I said. My frustration at having come so close to catching the thief had melted away, giving way to a euphoric thirst for action which temporarily eclipsed my fears about what might be hidden under that hood. The main thing was that we'd finally managed to stop the thief. We'd been able to save at least one story. That felt pretty good. Half an hour later, Werther and I had cut across the neighboring Russian authors and were sitting in a stylish compartment of a 19th century train carriage on the Moscow-St. Petersburg line. A snowstorm raged outside the window, and somewhere in the next carriage was sat the unhappy Anna Karenina, with whom Alexis had once been such good friends. We, however, were enjoying the cozy warmth and soft seats of our compartment. A gas lamp bathed the upholstery and plush carpets in a warm light, and Werther, who had never ridden a train before in his life, marveled at the rattle of the wheels and the far-off glimmer of the steam engine when it came into view at a bend in the track, twinkling amid the thickly falling snowflakes. For the first 10 minutes of our journey, he stayed glued to the window and peered out at the passing countryside, which was only dimly visible in the darkness. I left him to it and thought again about what I had found under the sofa in Will's cottage. So if we were to find the core ingredients of the stories, I began at last, would we be able to put them back? Would that make the story start working again? I dare say it would, murmured Werther, without taking his eyes off the window. He whooped like a little kid, with a steam engine let out a whistle. I said nothing for a while. Perhaps I could betray the ideas to their stories without anyone noticing. But that wouldn't be enough on its own if the thief just kept stealing more. How can we find out whether he's going to strike next? Werther tore his gaze away from the scenery at last and put his head to one side. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into an inner pocket of his waistcoat, took out the long letter he'd received that morning, and unfolded it. Well, it so happens that my friend Wilhelm and I have been debating that very question for some time now, and we have come to the conclusion that we must be a specific purpose behind the thefts, he explained. I sat up straighter. What purpose? Well, Werther drummed his fingertips together. I would naturally have spoken to you of this sooner, Miss Amy, he said, were it not for the fact that our alliance has acquired a new member of late. His eyelids slid sideways. Was it just my imagination, or did he sound ever so slightly hurt? I was not so sure, you see, whether I ought to take the risk, which is why I have preferred to remain silent until now. I opened my mouth to set Werther straight. I wanted to tell him he was being stupid, that of course we could trust Will, but the words wouldn't come. Werther looked me straight in the eye and handed me a piece of paper. It was a list written in his own squealy handwriting. Stolen ideas. 1. Alice in Wonderland. Rabbit's watch and a waistcoat. 2. Sleeping Beauty. Long sleep. 3. Picture of Dorian Gray. Picture. Elf King. Elf King. 5. Wizard of Oz. Cyclone. 6. The Little Prince Flower. 7. Midsummer Night's Dream. Summer. 8. Question mark. 9. Question mark. 10. Question mark. What about the treasures from the Arabian Nights and Dracula? I asked. And Elizabeth Bennet's carriage accident. But Werther waved these suggestions aside. No ideas were stolen in those instances. I read through his list again. And what do the 3 question marks at the end stand for? They are part of our theory. Werther leaned forward and clasped my hands in his. The gesture seemed a little uncalled for, and I was too excited, too eager to find out what he knew about the thief, so to give it much thought. His pale face was very close to mine now, so close I would make out every single one of his long eyelashes. We are afraid that a person stealing such powerful core ingredients as these can only have one thing in mind, he whispered. We are afraid this person plans to use them to create a new story. A shudder ran through him as he spoke. A new story? I stammered. Over the past few days, my trusty Wilhelm has immersed himself thoroughly in the annals of our world, and has discovered that it is indeed possible, but only if one succeeds in bringing 10 of the most powerful ideas in story of literature under one's control. I felt goosebumps on the back of my neck now, too. So there are only 3 to go. Metamorphosis would have been number 8. Werther nodded, but I still didn't fully understand. But why? I mean, if somebody wants to create a new story, why don't they just write one? Why do they have to go helping themselves to things out of other books? Werther came even closer. I could feel his breath on my lips. It smelt of peppermint and violets. Powerful ideas like these do not grow on trees, he whispered. They are extremely difficult to invent, and not everybody is capable of creating something new. We book characters, for example. Something slammed into the window pane from the outside, something far too blue to be a snowflake. We jumped. At last I backed away from Werther's violent breath and freed my hands from his grasp. I stood up and opened the compartment window to find a tiny fairy clinging to the window frame, flapping about in the wind. She stumbled inside the carriage accompanied by a blast of ice-cold night air and a flurry of snow, and landed on the seat beside me. Her wings were frozen stiff, and she squeaked out her message with such urgency that she tripped over her tongue in her agitation. She had to repeat herself 3 times before we realized that we had celebrated too soon. While we had been chugging through the Russian winter, the thief had been carrying out another raid. He'd infiltrated the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and made off with no less than Mr. Hyde himself. Darn it, I bit my lip. Why had we let him get away? How were we supposed to protect the book world when the moment we thwarted him in one book, the thief simply turned his attentions to another? As Werther took out his quill, crossed the question mark next to number 8 on his list, and replaced it with the title of the book, my mind began to whirl again, so fast that I felt sick. If Werther and Wilhelm were right, somebody was dismantling the great works of the world literature in order to build a new story. But who would want to do that? Betsy? Lady Merritt? I swallowed hard and thought very quietly, Will? The princess was young and fair. She had hair down to her heels and dressed every day in the finest of gowns. When she laughed, all the kingdom was entranced. She was the fairest child in all the land. 15. The Forgotten Girl. The ringing of the alarm clock on my phone chased away my troubled dreams. My brain felt as though it had been transformed overnight into a wet sponge which was now sliding this way and that inside my head. I groaned as I swung my legs out of bed and blinked in the dull morning light, but at least I could think clearly enough now to know what I had to do. At that, sooner I did it the better. It was early, not even properly light yet. My book jumping lesson in the secret library awaited me. I staggered into the bathroom for a shower, then picked a few clothes up off the floor at random and slipped them on. I brushed my teeth with one hand and tied my hair back with a messy bun with the other. Having neglected to look in the mirror, I didn't realize until I was halfway downstairs that I was wearing the hideous sweater Alexis had bought me in Lerwick. I didn't care. On the ground floor, I grabbed a slice of bread from the breakfast table as I passed, and headed straight out of the front door. The gravel was wet with dew and crunched under my feet. Cool, damp air filled my lungs. I left the grounds of Linux House, but I didn't take the path to the secret library. No, I hurried out onto the moor. Suddenly I was overcome by such a sense of urgency that I started running. Some indefinable feeling told me there was no time to waste. I was out of breath by the time I reached Will's cottage. I went in without knocking and made a beeline for the sofa. Will, who was halfway through putting on a pair of jeans, was so taken aback that he got his foot stuck in one of the legs and fell against the stove. "I am me," he stuttered. "Hello, has something happened?" Without even looking at him, I threw myself to the floor. I searched the hiding place under the sofa, feeling around with both hands, peering into every corner, brushing aside the cobwebs. Nothing. I gasped. Amy? Will crouched down beside me. "Is everything okay?" I leaped to my feet and backed away from him. Where are they? If I was going to repair the stories like Werther had said, I would need the core ingredients, but I was too late. I could have kicked myself. "Where are they?" I hissed again. Will raised his eyebrows. He stared at me uncomprehendingly. "Where are what?" "The ideas," I whispered. "They were here yesterday, Will. I saw them. So where are they?" With every word, the wave of fear inside me rose higher and higher. It felt like it was about to come crashing down and wash me away. I didn't even want Will to reply. I didn't want to hear him admit it. I just wanted to find the ideas and take them back to their stories. Will frowned. "Ideas? What ideas? What do you mean?" "The stolen ideas," I said flatly. "The ideas that have disappeared from the book world. They were under your sofa." "Under my sofa?" He knelt down and peered underneath it. Meanwhile, the wave of fear rose higher still, creeping up through my chest and pushing painfully at my throat. Then it broke with a roar that swept away everything in me. My vision blurred. All of a sudden, the cottage around us seemed to grow tinier, the dirty walls closing in on me, along with a truth that hurt too much to acknowledge. The next moment, I went stumbling out of the cottage. I slumped down outside the door and hid my face in my hands. I was determined not to have any real friends in this world. It was better to trust nobody. Would I never learn that lesson? Then I felt an arm around my shoulders. Will had sat down beside me. I recognized his familiar smell. I wanted to shake him off and run away, but I didn't have the strength. "So you found stolen ideas in my cottage yesterday, and you didn't tell me?" murmured Will. "Did you think I'd hidden them there?" I didn't answer. Will sighed. "It wasn't me, Amy. It wasn't me, okay? Please believe me. I had no idea they were there." I looked up. "Really? But then how did they and where?" Will thought for a moment, then said, "I think I know who's taken them." He looked me straight in the eye, and I could see no hint of a lie in his face as he went on. "When I woke from one night of my nightmares last night, the little girl was lying on the rug by the sofa. I thought she was asleep, so I didn't disturb her, but now I reckon it was her who took the ideas. Remember when we found her messing with my chest of books the other day? She probably left the ideas behind when she ran away from us and came back for them last night." I blinked. What Will was saying made sense. It made wonderful sense, and it struck all the dead pain and fear and horrible thoughts inside me with one blow. I fell into Will's arms and pulled him toward me so hard I bit his lip when I kissed him. But he didn't complain. We fell backward onto the muddy path. I kissed him and he kissed me back. He loosened the bun of my hair and buried his hands in it, and all the thoughts flew out of my head. But it wasn't long before they returned. "So the little girl has something to do with the thefts," I mused once we got our breath back. Will nodded. He looked even more disheveled than usual, with his lips were red. "We have to find out more about her, and fast." Half an hour later, we were marching side by side across the island. Stormsay wasn't very big, and I thought I knew every corner of it already, but I realized now that I'd been quite wrong. Will led me down to the beach, and from there northward along the coast. McAllister Castle soon loomed up ahead of us, and I gaped at it. I'd never seen the castle from this angle before. Its formidable turrets looked even higher from here than they did from inland. They scraped the sky like the fingers of an ugly giant. The black stone from which Will's ancestors had built the fortress was porous and shot through with cracks. sprouting clumps of weeds. Facing onto the beach was the wrought iron gate, beyond which a passageway led deep into the bowels of the castle's foundations. Will explained this was the tunnel to the old dungeons which the McAllisters had once used for the starving prisoners to death, preferably members of the Linux clan. But the castle was not the northernmost point of Stormsay, as I'd previously thought. Beyond it were several rugged headlands, like fingers, feeling their way out onto the slate-grey sea. They were too narrow to build on, and over time the water had carved countless caves and gullies out of them, so they now resembled miniature mountain ranges. All the island's paths petered out when they reached these headlands, and the beach narrowed and eventually disappeared altogether. The only things that lived out here were a colony of puffins, who were currently eyeing us with suspicion. He came to a standstill. "Welcome to the end of the world," said Will, putting an arm around me. I sighed. I admired the harsh beauty of the crags, but I was slightly afraid to go on. Surely with my levels of coordination it would be a miracle if I made it to the end of any of these headlands in one piece. The same thought seemed to have occurred to Will. He cast a glance at my canvas pumps. "We have to be careful. Under the surface there are loads of rocks with sharp edges, so if you fall in—" "Relax," I interrupted him, forcing a smile. "We'll be fine. Fortunately, I happen to be very coordinated." Without a moment's hesitation, I clambered up onto the nearest of the jutting rocks and promptly slipped on a clump of long-haired seaweed. A second later I was up to my knees in the water with grazes on both my hands. "You're right," said Will, hoisting me back up onto dry land. "This is going to be a piece of cake." For the next few hours we scrambled along each of the headlands in turn and peered into every cave and behind us every ledge we could find. It was a sweaty business. The wind jostled us roughly. The crags did not, unfortunately, get any less slippery. I kept missing my footing and having to be rescued by Will. Once I came so close to falling that if Will hadn't managed to grab hold of my elbow and pull me back just in time, I would surely have plunged headfirst into the sea and cracked my head open on the shimmering underwater rocks below. Will, when he wasn't saving me from certain death, explored the fissures in the rock with his flashlight, illuminating even the very narrowest of crevices. But all we found were little pools of still greenish water, then abandoned birds' nests. On the first two headlands, anyway. It wasn't until the afternoon, when we reached the outermost point of the third headland, that the beam of Will's flashlight suddenly fell upon something else, something that didn't belong there. The cave lay hidden behind a curtain of seaweed. We would never even have spotted it if one of the puffins hadn't poked its brightly colored beak out through the greenery just as we were passing by the cave mouth. It flew away in fright as I took hold of the curtain. We pushed through the moss and the seaweed and left the daylight behind us. It wasn't a particularly large cave, little more than an alcove, really, and the child wasn't there. But there was no doubt that we had found her hiding place. Will gave a sharp intake of breath. "What?" I whispered, but he didn't reply. The roar of the waves was muffled in here as if it came from far away. The cave walls were damp and almost completely covered in lichens. Only one part of the wall, directly above what looked like the primitive sort of bed, had been scraped clean. The flashlight beam came to a halt on this patch of wall, snagged on the glistening red letters, "I have awoken." Goosebumps ran down my spine. There were grooves in the rock where the red stuff was, as if somebody had tried to scratch it off. Will stared long and hard at the words. I could see from his face that he was thinking about Holmes. I left him and went over to examine what I had assumed was a bed. The first thing I realized was that it wasn't actually a bed at all. It just looked like one. The floor of the cave was carpeted with moss and tendrils, and seaweed and seashells had gotten tangled up in them. They must have built it up over the time to form a layer as thick as a mattress. In the middle of this mass of plants and sludge was a small hollow, an imprint left by a body. The imprint was the size of a child, and it looked as though the child had lain here on her bed of seaweed for a very long time, so long that the tendrils had started to grow up around her. You could distinctly see the curve of the head, the shape of the shoulders, even the impressions of the hands and feet, as if the body hadn't moved an inch. How long did somebody have to lie still for something like this to form? I felt among the tendrils and seaweed for the shimmering glass spheres, but the ideas were nowhere to be found. I did come across something else, however, a sort of semicircular metal bar, jagged and overgrown with moss and weeds along one side. I pulled it out of the tangle of plants. "Give me some light," I said to Will. The flashlight beam darted toward me. What had looked at first glance like fragments of a seashell were in fact stones, which seemed to be set into the piece of curved metal, dirty stones. As I scraped the layer of mud that covered them, something gleamed suddenly red beneath my fingers. I dipped the object in a puddle on the ground and rubbed it with the sleeve of my sweater until the dirt began to come away. Rubies appeared. The curved object in my hands was no random piece of flotsam. It was a diadem. "Is that a crown?" asked Will. I shrugged. "Could be." I rubbed one of the gemstones with my thumb. "Yes, I think it is. What does that mean?" My eyes were drawn back to the imprint of the little body. The child had lain there, in the cave, then presumably for quite a long time. Years even? I thought for a while as Will inspected the diadem. She's a book character, I said at last. She must be. A kind of princess or something. And I think she comes from the same legend as Glenn, Clyde, and Desmond. What? Will exclaimed. What makes you think that? Well, she stole these scraps of the manuscript, and before that she must have been lying here for a very long time, don't you think? Look how the plants have grown up around her body. Didn't you say all book characters have long naps once every 100 years? Yes, they do, but a 300-year nap? Anyway, Glenn, Clyde, and Desmond were only ones to be rescued from the fire. Perhaps in all the commotion our ancestors lost track of who was rescued. Yeah, sure. The corners of Will's mouth twitched. She escaped without anyone noticing when she woke up, and 300 years later she immediately made a note of it here on the wall and then came and graffitied it above my stove. Is that it? He lowered himself onto the slippery bed of seaweed. Okay, it is pretty weird, I admitted, but I felt as though the puzzle pieces in my head were gradually starting to slot together. But I still think that's what happened. She's a princess from Desmond's fairy tale, and she wants to go back there. That's why she needs the ideas from the book world. Do you see? She wants to repair the manuscript. A wave of relief flooded through me as I finally understood what was going on. Suddenly I knew what I had to do. If we can find out more about the story that got burned, I told him, I'm sure we will be able to see a pattern and stop her. And then, Amy, what are you talking about? Will interrupted my torrent of words. What kind of pattern? And what makes you think there's some way of repairing the manuscript all of a sudden? I sat down beside him and told him about Werther's theory and this list of stolen ideas. Werther says that if the thief managed to get hold of certain ideas, then he or she would be able to create a whole new story. So surely it would be even easier to use the ideas to patch up an existing story, wouldn't it? Will looked up for a moment, then nodded. Okay, so assuming she's found a way into the book world and she's trying to repair the legend, if we can find out which two ideas she still needs to steal, then we can get there first and intercept her. A look of grim determination settled over Will's features. His story blue eyes glittered. Let's do it, he said, and then we'll see what she has to say for herself about what she did to Holmes. I took his hands in mine and squeezed them. Will's jaw tightened. The muscles in his face twitched. Come on, I said, and led him out of the cave. We searched the fourth and fifth headlands for the princess, too, just to be sure. It was possible, after all, that she was hiding from us somewhere close by. But in none of the other caves did we find anything like a bed made of seaweed or a crown of blood-red rubies, or even so much as a child's muddy footprint on the rocks. It was evening by the time we finally headed home, and every muscle in my body ached. As we walked along the beach past McAllister's castle and the rusty submarine graveyard, my head was still spinning with thoughts of the princess and her plan. On the one hand, I felt relieved that we'd finally stumbled upon a clue we could use, but on the other hand, I got the feeling there was still something I was missing. But what? Hazy images for our hunt and the thief swirled through my mind. There was an insight somewhere in this muddle of thoughts that I couldn't quite put my finger on, and the harder I tried, the further it slipped away from me. Will, too, looked pensive. His gaze seemed to have turned inward. We probably both needed some time to digest what we'd found out, and there was so much to think about, important clues that we couldn't just quite seem to make sense of. At the secret library, Will kissed me on the cheek and headed off down the spiral staircase to question Glenn and Clyde about their legend. But I, having bunked off lessons that day, thought it best to stay out of Glenn's way and carried on toward Lennox's house to grill Desmond. He'd spent the day with Alexis and was probably still there. Perhaps he'd be able to give me something to go on. As I crossed the grounds, the sound of Alexis and Desmond talking drifted toward me on the wind. It came from somewhere very high up and put a stop to my musings for the time being. I followed the voices upward and emerged a few minutes later through the skylight onto the roof of the house. I inched hand over hand across the tiles to the dormer window where my parents had made themselves comfortable. They smiled when they saw me. There was a picnic basket between them, and they were each holding a glass of wine. Sitting there side by side, pink-cheeked and bright-eyed, they looked the very embodiment of happiness. I sat down beside Alexis, who draped one of the old blankets around my shoulders by way of a greeting and murmured, "Little giraffe, you look tired." Desmond slid a plate of sandwiches over to me. "Would you like one?" he asked. I nodded and helped myself. I hadn't realized how hungry I was. I'd had nothing to eat since that slice of bread this morning. After all, perhaps that was why I was finding it so hard to concentrate. Alexis and Desmond drank their wine, while I wolfed down the sandwich after sandwich, and the fog that had been clouding my brain lifted a little with every bite. Some of the sandwiches were vegan, with grilled vegetables and hummus, but there were some tuna and some cheese ones as well. I demolished 3 of each type in quick succession. As I ate, I watched the sun setting over the sea and Lady Merritt, in a sweater just as colorful as mine, slipping out of the wrought iron gate onto the moor. At last I felt more or less full, ready to tell them why I was there. "Desmond," I began, without beating around the bush, "was there a princess in your story, too?" He choked out his mouthful of food and coughed. "I beg your pardon?" Yes, there was." He cleared his throat. "You know what, Amy? I must have told you I come from a fairy tale, and in the fairy tale I was a knight, sent by a princess to kill a monster. The thing about the knight and the monster sounded familiar, but I wasn't sure he'd ever mentioned the princess before." So you knew her. Was she still a child? I persisted. He lowered his eyelids. Yes, she said softly. What did she look like? Did she wear a crown set with rubies? How old was she roughly? Desmond set his glass down on the roof much too hard. Why do you want to know all this? He still wasn't looking at me. I do not like talking about my home. It is still very difficult for me. And I wouldn't ask you if it wasn't important, but it's to do with the thefts in the book world. Will and I may have found a clue, and the clue leads back to my story. Desmond raised his eyebrows. Alexis eyed me curiously. It looks that way, I said. Can't you just tell me a bit more about what happened in your story? The monster, for example. Was it a dragon or something? No. Suddenly he fixed me with a piercing gaze. Suddenly he seemed angry. What have Clyde and Glenn told you? Nothing, I assured him hurriedly, and Desmond's expression softened a little. I just need to find out a few things. Was there a cyclone in the story by any chance, or a metamorphosis? Like when Gregor Samsa turns into a beetle, or when Dr. Jekyll turns into Mr. Hyde, I mean? Amy, Alexis broke in. Desmond's story was a fairy tale from the Middle Ages. So? I said. Desmond said nothing. He had turned pale, and his eyes were fixed to a spot somewhere far away on the dark moor. All of a sudden we heard a child crying in the distance. It sounded like the heart-rending sobs of a little girl. When the princess learned of the knight's death, she wept. She wept bitterly. Who would protect her now? Who would fight for her now? The princess was afraid, and the fear was even worse than the loneliness. The fear was a monster that pierced her with its sharp claws. A terrible monster. 16. The Princess. He found Lady Mary at dawn. Will had woken suddenly from another nightmare, drenched in sweat, and hadn't been able to get back to sleep. He put on some clothes and wandered out into the misty dawn. And he'd considered bringing the Hound of the Baskervilles out into the story to play fetch with him, though he'd vowed never to set foot in any Sherlock stories ever again. For the past few days, Peter Pan was the only story he jumped into. He missed the Hound more than he cared to admit. That was why he was now carrying both books in his coat pockets wherever he went, just in case. Will could feel the books pressing against his chest. He thought of the dog's big wet nose, its faithful eyes, and its saucer-sized paws. Was it time for a reunion? He didn't get the chance to answer his own question, however, because that was when he saw her. For one confused second, he thought it was the dog lying there in the heather close to the cottage, curled up on the ground waiting for him. But it wasn't, of course. Nobody had freed the huge hound from his story. It still stalked its own fictional moor, not the real one on Stormsay. The body lying amid the tiny purple blossoms was too slim to be the dog's, and it had no fur. It was a human body. It was Lady Merritt. Will dropped to his knees beside her. Lady Merritt was motionless, her eyes closed. She looked much smaller than usual, breakable like a doll. She lay on her back, one hand resting on her stomach and the other beside her face. There was a dark stain on the yarn of her colorfully woolly sweater. Something wet had seeped into it, something which had once been warm and red, which came from a hole in her chest. Like Holmes, thought Will. It was all he could think. He dug his hands into the heather and crushed the blossoms, killing them. This time no seashells cut into his skin. This time it wasn't his best and oldest friend he was kneeling beside. This time it wasn't too late. Almost imperceptibly, Lady Merritt's chest rose and fell. She was breathing shallowly, but she was breathing. Will ran. He sprinted across the moor to the stone circle. It wasn't far. He took the stairs 2 and 3 at a time and raced through the aisles of the secret library. Glenn and Clyde, who had been tight-lipped when he'd asked them about the fairy tale in the previous evening, were in their workshop putting a new binding on the book of love poetry. When they saw the look on Will's face, they put the book aside immediately. As they ran up the stairs together, Will told him what had happened. Glenn hurried after him to the patch of heather while Clyde went to sound the alarm at Link's house. Lady Merritt was still breathing. Glenn felt her pulse. Will didn't know what to do. He rocked from one foot to the other. Soon the others arrived. Alexis and Amy were still in their pajamas. Desmond had his arm around Alexis, and Mr. Stephen was speaking urgently into an old-fashioned radio. Then they huddled around the pale body and waited. Alexis sobbed quietly. Amy trembled. Will took her hand and squeezed it. He dreamed about her again last night. At least Amy's name had been mentioned, hadn't it? The memory was already fading, but he still had a vague inkling. Sherlock's dead body had appeared in his dream, as always, but this time Will had not been the only one standing over the dead body. The princess had been there. She had been holding a dagger, and she'd asked him something about Amy. Will couldn't remember what it was, but the princess must not have liked his reply, because she had immediately started to cry loudly and piercingly like a small child. The helicopter approached from the south. Its rotors clattered in the wind and circled above the island as it tried to locate them. Then at last it began its descent. The heather parted beneath its skids as it landed a few yards away. Suddenly everything happened very fast. The emergency doctor jumped out and immediately inserted a cannula into Marehead's arm. She still wasn't moving. The paramedics carried her inside the helicopter on a stretcher. Alexis and Mr. Stevens got in too. Accompanying Lady Marehead to the hospital on mainland, the rotor blades began to clatter again and the helicopter rose into the air. They gazed after it until it was just a tiny dot on the horizon. What if they'd found Sherlock sooner? Would he have been taken away in a rescue helicopter too? Would he have survived? Will pressed his lips tightly together. It was Glenn who finally broke the silence. Somebody has to tell the Laird what has happened, he remarked. And of course he was right. Though everybody on Stormsay must surely have seen the helicopter, the Laird would still expect an official report, and he would still want to hear from a member of his own clan. I'll do it, said Will. Glenn nodded. Good. We'll be in the library if you need our help. He, Clyde, and Desmond left the scene of the accident now, too, and Will was left alone with Amy. The heather was red where Lady Mary had lain, and Amy was still trembling. Will took off his sweater and gave it to her. Amy slipped it on immediately afterward. She grabbed his hand again as if it was the only thing stopping her from drowning in the heather. May I come with you? She asked. I don't want to be on my own, of course. Together they made their way toward the castle. McAllister Castle was just as uncomfortable and drafty on the inside as it had looked from the outside. The sea breeze whistled through the cracks in the walls. The windows were dirty and so tiny that they hardly let in any light at all. They were probably former loopholes, now fitted with panes of glass. A muzzle of cannon would have been fitted through them, sunbeams not so much. Will led me along the corridors of the castle, which felt to me like a labyrinth of shadows. I still couldn't believe what had happened. My poor grandmother. I began to tremble more violently, but it wasn't fear making me quiver any more, it was fury. How could somebody just stab another person in the chest like that in cold blood? Rage ran hot through my veins, pulsing up my temples. I was sure the princess was the perpetrator. Who else on the island would have attacked my grandmother? What the H was wrong with this child? I pictured myself finding her at last, shaking her till she told me what this was all about. Stealing from literature was one thing, it was awful, but attacking a human being, the mere thought of it, walking up to somebody and sticking a dagger in them, rage burned behind my eyes and my fist clenched. But the princess, of course, was not here. My anger wasn't helping me right now. I let out my breath and decided to take a leaf out of Werther's book for once and think logically about what had happened. I concentrated on suppressing my anger as Will and I mounted a long flight of stairs to the top of one of the formidable turrets. It took me several floors, but I worked. The clues made more and more sense to me with every flight of stairs we climbed. By the time we reached the top of the tower, I'd made a list in my head similar to Werther's. Attempts to kill me. 1. Poisoned cake in Alice in Wonderland. 2. Falling boulder at the stone circle. 3. Dagger attack in A Midsummer Night's Dream. 4. Dagger attack in Stormsay, mistaking Lady Marehead for me. It had occurred to me some time ago that somebody might have been trying to poison me with that cake in Wonderland. My grandmother had been adamant from the start that food in the book world couldn't go bad. And since it turned out to not have been the only time someone had tried to kill me, it no longer seemed at all far-fetched to suppose that I might have been given the cake on purpose. Only the poison obviously hadn't been strong enough to actually kill me. After that, I narrowly avoided being crushed by a falling boulder at the stone circle. The fact that a stone which must have been standing there since time immemorial had suddenly fallen off the precise moment I was standing underneath it seemed a tad too improbable to be a coincidence. I was lucky that Will had shoved me out of the way in time. And thirdly, there had been a dagger attack at A Midsummer Night's Dream, which had quite clearly been intentional, as had the attack on the moor last night. The first time the princess had failed to do what she set out to do, but the second time the dagger had found its mark, except that the princess had got the wrong person. I didn't know why I felt so sure of it, but I was almost certain the attack had been meant for me. After all, my grandmother and I had been wearing almost exactly the same sweater yesterday, and Lady Mary had been found right next to Will's cottage. In the dark, the princess had probably thought it was me on my way to see Will. What would my grandmother have been doing there, after all? Wait a minute, what had she been doing out there? I banished the thought from my mind for the moment. All in all, I felt my list had made quite a lot of sense. I decided to write it down when I got home and show it to Werther later on. One question remained, and that, unfortunately, was the most important one of all. Why? Will and I entered the tower room. It was musty and somber. The walls were hung with portraits of the McAllisters' ancestors. Behind a massive desk sat the Laird with an accounts book, totting up the numbers from a pile of receipts, which Betsy was handing to him one by one. The Laird grimaced when he saw me at Will's side, but said nothing. What's happened? Asked Betsy. Will told them. The Laird listened in silence. The look on his face remained grim, but his nostrils flared at the mention of Lady Mare's name. I hope she pulls through, was all he muttered when Will finished speaking. And at these words, something inside me plummeted from my chest into the backs of my knees. The fact that my grandmother that her injuries might be too serious, was something I'd been trying not to admit myself until now. Betsy, too, had grown paler and paler with every word Will had spoken. The pile of receipts had slipped out of her hands and fluttered to the floor, but she was now gripping the edge of her desk so hard that her knuckles had gone white. I looked searchingly into her eyes. Was Lady Marehead on her way to meet you again? Betsy swallowed hard. What are you talking about? She croaked. The Laird turned his head to look at Betsy, and his eyebrows crept angrily up her forehead like hairy caterpillars. I have no idea what Amy means, Betsy protested. her voice shaking. She bit her lip. You know where she was going, I declared. She didn't answer. Instead, she let go of the edge of the desk and took 2 unsteady steps toward the door. Then all of a sudden, she lurched past us and down the stairs. I turned on my heel and gave chase. And as I ran, I could hear the laird ordering Will to pick up the receipts. Betsy sprinted down the stairs 2 at a time, turned off into one of the corridors, and went zigzagging through the rooms of the castle. But she couldn't shake me off, no matter how hard she tried. This seemed to dawn on her eventually. At last she scurried into a room with rose-spattered wallpaper from which there was nowhere else to run. She sank breathlessly up to an upholstered stool beside a dressing table, folded her arms, and cocked her chin defiantly as I approached. Her blonde hair shone in the illuminated mirror behind her. What do you want? Absolutely exhausted, I stood there trying to get my breath back so I could question her. How on earth had Betsy managed to emerge from this sprint through the castle looking like the candidate for Germany's next top model, about to poise for her next photo shoot? I put my hands on my hips and felt the sharp stab of a stitch in my side. What do you know? I panted. Nothing. Betsy! I moved closer until I was standing right in front of her. My grandmother is in the hospital. Somebody tried to stab her to death, okay? So do me a favor and stop peeing about. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why was she out on the moor last night? What are the two of you up to? Betsy put her head in her hands and exhaled slowly. I was helping her, she muttered. She came to me a few weeks ago and asked me to take care of a few things for her in the book world. She wanted me to jump there at night and steal some stuff. A bit of gold, a few treasures, just a little bit here and there so people would hardly notice. I guessed you stole from literature. No, okay, fine, we stole the stuff, but only for Storm's sake, and we never laid a finger on any of the ideas, I swear. Plus, I only went to the novels and fairy tales where they've got more than enough gold already. The Sultan from Aladdin can easily spare a few kilos of gemstones. Have you seen how rich he is? And anyway, we took everything back a few days ago because your grandma suddenly got cold feet. Or because she realized how immoral the whole thing was. Oh yeah, sniffed Betsy. Would you prefer it if there were no book jumpers left at all? What do you mean? Your clan has run out of money. You're bankrupt. How much do you think it costs to sit around on an island for hundreds of years doing nothing but reading? For a long time the families were very wealthy, but over the years your families broke. Your castles got burned down, and you had to build a new mansion, for your finances went downhill pretty rapidly. And my family is in more or less the same boat. We've got a bit more money in reserve because our castle is still standing, but it will run out eventually too. Your grandma and I wanted to secure the clan's future by giving the Liddixes a bit of cash injection, so the laird a little nest egg too, so that we can stay here, so that we can keep jumping and taking care of the book world, Amy. I stared at her, apart from the fact that I'd been wondering for some time now how good it actually was for literature to have us jumping around in it. This whole thing was outrageous. We can't just help ourselves to stuff in the book world. It's a good thing we took those treasures back, I declared. Poof, said Betsy, tilting backward on her stool against the edge of the dressing table. The arsenal of little pots and tubes piled up on it began to wobble. Only now did I realize that this must be her bedroom. It was a lot more homey than the rest of the McAllister castle. Beside the bed were piles of books that wouldn't fit on the shelves, and on the bedside table was a photo of a woman in a blue summer dress who looked exactly like Betsy. I thought the literature was so important to you. Will said you'd do anything to protect it. Would you prefer us to leave Stormsay? Said Betsy tonelessly. That's what will end up happening sooner or later, Amy. And that will be the end of everything our clans have built up over so many generations. We'll never be able to jump again. I shrugged. This wasn't the right time to tell Betsy about my gift. And anyway, the family's financial woes were not exactly on top of our list of priorities right now, given that my grandmother had nearly been murdered and might be fighting for her life at this very moment. If the treasure is back where it belongs, then what was Lady Mara doing out there last night? I returned to the issue at hand, and Betsy went white again. That was my fault, she said, her shoulders sagging. I asked her to meet me at the stone circle again. We can't give up Stormsay and the book world. They're my home. I wanted to try and persuade her that we should take a little bit of gold for the fairy tales after all, but she didn't come, because somebody stopped her. Yes, Betsy lowered her eyes. When Will and I landed in the book world later that morning, we could see from Werther's face that something else had happened. In the ink pot, we brought each other up to speed on recent events. It looked as though the princess had made full use of the previous night, not only to stab my grandmother, but also to acquire the ninth idea, as we now learned that the evil was missing from Wuthering Heights. Werther told us it was the most embarrassable to see the character suddenly so polite and kind and completely lacking in vengefulness. There was basically no plot left at all. We talked for a while about our lists and our suspicions. The princess only needed one more idea then, but what kind of idea? What story should we read next? Will and I hadn't managed to find out anything new about the burned fairy tale the previous night. All we knew was that it was about a knight who was sent by a princess to fight a monster who died at the end of its story. Both the knight and the princess had escaped the flames, as we now knew. Both were living on Stormsay. What about the monster? Asked Will at last. If it was burned along with the manuscript, won't she need a new one? Werther wobbled his head from side to side. Perhaps, and unfortunately, literature is only too full of terrible creatures. Yes, but it has to be a story where the monster plays a crucial role. She only steals the core ingredients, I reminded him. For the next half hour, we racked our brains trying to think which monster out that might be the story to fit the description. The more horror stories we came up with, the more anxious Werther became, mainly at the thought of having to go inside these stories and confront the princess, as we had done in Metamorphosis, but in the end he promised, in spite of himself, to ask around and report back to us as soon as he heard anything. Will and I, for our part, jumped back to the outside world to look for the princess. At regular intervals we roved across the moor, and we scanned the first page of Peter Pan, which was where Werther was to sound the alarm if anything unusual occurred. The moor, the whole of Stormsay, in fact, felt more deserted than usual today, perhaps because Alexis and Mr. Stevens were still at the hospital with Lady Merritt. Perhaps because early that evening, just to make matters worse, it began pouring down with rain. The raindrops fell thick and fast, cloaking the landscape in an impenetrable grayness which made every bush and shrub look the same. In weather like this, it was impossible to find somebody who didn't want to be found. Within minutes, Will and I were soaked to the skin, and we had to accept that it was pointless to continue the search under these conditions. We decided to go back to Will's cottage. As we approached it, however, a figure emerged from the wall of rain ahead of us. I almost screamed in fright. It wasn't the princess. The figure was too tall and broad-shouldered. He was wearing blue dungarees and a t-shirt with a faded picture on the front, and the fuzzy hair on his cheeks shone like a damp, shaggy fur of an animal. His close-set eyes were fixed on me. Amy, said Brock. It was the first time I'd ever heard him open his mouth other than to count something. He extended his huge hand toward me. At first I tried to shake it, but then I spotted the key he was holding out to me. It was large and rusty. What's that for? One, said Brock, taking my hand and pressing the key into my palm. The thing was heavier than it looked. One key, he nodded. One key, Amy. One princess, one knight. Be careful, said Brock. What do you mean? Do you know where the princess is? At that, he grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me closer to him, until his rough-hewn nose was almost touching mine. Be careful, he said again, in a whisper this time. Then he let go of me, pointed to the key, and nodded. Before I could reply, he turned away and disappeared into the grey haze. Will and I watched him go, open-mouthed. What was that? I asked. My upper arms were tingling where Brock had grabbed hold of them. Will shrugged. No idea, but that key looks familiar, he murmured. I think I know what it opens. He brushed a strand of wet hair off my forehead. Come with me. Where? To the castle. So we turned our backs on Will's cottage, which was now only a few yards away, and battled our way through the storm and hand in hand. The wind whipped to the rain almost sideways across the island, and the icy drops stung my face. But I didn't care. The key was a promise. It would lead me to a door, and behind that door would be another piece of the puzzle. There had to be. We arrived at McAllister Castle and went in, leaving puddles on the corridor floors. We marched straight to the part of the castle that had once been the kitchens, where food had once been cooked over an open fire. We opened up a worm-eaten door to reveal a spiral staircase. A musty smell greeted us, and an age-old chill. We descended the well-trodden steps deep into the foundations of the McAllister's family seat, where I soon realized so many of the ancestors had been kept prisoner. We were headed for the dungeons. The deeper underground we went, the more uncomfortable and low-ceilinged the tunnels became as they wound their way through the rock beneath the fortress. There was no electricity down here. All we had was Will's flashlight, its beam dancing ahead of us in the soot-blackened stone. In spite of the thick walls, we could hear the soughing of the sea, and I thought of the entrance of the castle on the beach, which we had passed only yesterday. Barred doors and windows were set into the walls here and there. The cells beyond lay in complete darkness. The locks were large and rusty, but the key didn't fit any of them. One after the other, Will shone his flashlight into all of the dungeons. They were all empty. Why had the McAllisters needed so many jail cells? A chill ran down my spine as the flashlight beam fell upon a collection of strange instruments. The light glanced off something serrated, something that must have been used on the prisoners here, sharp and painful. I felt for Will's hand and pressed closer to him. The ceiling was so low by now that we had to stoop. But we kept going, and at last we rounded a corner. The tunnel suddenly brightened around us. Somebody had lit several flaming torches, mounted in brackets on the wall. The flames crackled and bathed the last of the dungeons in a flickering light. This last dungeon was not empty. Inside was a thin pallet, and on the pallet sat a child in a tattered dress. Her dirty hair spread around her like a cloak. Her dark eyes reflected the firelight. Brock had succeeded then, where we had failed. He had captured the princess. I knew without having to try that the key would fit. Will dropped the flashlight the instant he caught sight of the little girl. His shoulders trembled, and he gritted his teeth so hard that I could hear them grinding against one another. The sound echoed through the dungeons and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The princess, however, didn't even blink. For a moment it looked as though Will was going to rush up to the cell door, rattle at the bars, and start screaming at the princess to tell him why she had killed Holmes. But he regained his composure and approached the little girl with unexpected calmness. Their eyes seemed to bore into each other. "Give me the key, Amy," he said quietly, the words trembling in his throat. The metal of the key had warmed up in my hands. I ran my fingertips over the rusty key bit and thought about my grandmother and the blood-stained heather where she had lain. I thought about the chaos in the book world and the stories that had been so cruelly mutilated, and I thought about the fact that this child had tried to kill me. Then I put the key in the trouser pocket and let out a sigh. "No." Will looked at me. "As long as she's in there, she can't do any more harm," I explained. "And it'll give us time to think." "About what?" "About what we're going to do with her," I said flatly. Will wove his fingers through mine, almost crushing them. "Okay, agreed," he said at last with a sigh. "Agreed," I echoed, just for something to say. A silent princess in her cell was so ghostly, so unreal that she was there. For a while we just stood there and stared at the child, who had put her head to one side and was gazing intently back at us. I'd expected hatred to flare up in me when we found her, rage, a thirst for revenge, but all I felt was uneasy and a little helpless. Here she was, then, the girl Will, Werther, and I had been searching for weeks. Brock had practically handed her to us on a silver platter, but what now? Again I sensed, somewhere at the edges of my consciousness, that I was missing something. "Where are the stolen ideas?" I asked the princess. "What have you hidden them?" But she didn't answer, of course. She simply lowered her eyes and turned away from us. Her back was so bony, her elbows jutted out so sharply from the curtain of matted hair. She must be half starved. A touch of pity wormed its way into my thoughts. The key lay heavy against my thigh. Pity? I pulled Will hurriedly away from the cell door. The flashlight had broken when he dropped it, so he took one of the flaming torches from its bracket and walked back down the tunnel away from the little girl. We could still hear her, however, as we turned the corner. She knew, she said in her high, clear child's voice, as if trying to console herself, that he would stop the monster. We hastened our steps, running along the stone passageways, up the stairs to the corridors of the castle. Soon we were stepping back out into the rain. The storm was fiercer now, whipping up the surface of the sea and sending tongues of lightning flickering across the sky where mountains of dark black clouds were massing. But I welcomed the icy raindrops on my skin. They seemed to wash away my confusion. The wind swept all the way my emotions, and the thunder silenced the whispering voices in the back of my head. They were replaced by cold, clear thoughts. Thoughts like frozen glass, ice cold and sharp. At last I tramped across the moor at Will's side. I realized what it was that had been troubling me since the previous day. At last I saw what it was all about this that didn't fit together. The thief Werther and I had seen in the book world was not a child. He was bigger, as big as a grown man. Then I had realized too late, far too late. How could he not have realized the transformation? What had he done? "17. The monster." We missed Werther's alarm. Will and I had spent the night in his cottage, where we'd taken turns to stay awake and keep watch in case Werther found out any new information and needed to get a hold of us. One of us had slept on the sofa while the other kept an eye on the first page of Peter Pan. But at some point the system seemed to have broken down because when I opened my eyes at daybreak, Will was nowhere to be seen. His copy of Peter Pan lay abandoned on the rug by the stove. The book was still open, and I could still see a glance that the action had been interrupted several times by a young man in silk stockings shouting my name. "Miss Amy, he is back," he'd yelled, right after the first line about all the children having to grow up. "The Odyssey! It is the Odyssey! Come quickly!" At this point, Werther withdrew into the background of the story, but before long, just after the bit about the kiss hidden in the corner of Wendy's mother's mouth, he popped up again. "Miss Amy, where are you? Should I go alone?" A few lines later, Werther began running frantically to and fro. "Miss Amy." I turned the page. Werther must have indeed gone into the Odyssey without me, because on the second page the story continued as normal. But on the third page, Werther could be seen flitting about again. He came charging back from the story right through the middle of two paragraphs. This time his clothes were wet and he looked bruised and battered. "Miss Amy," he shouted, "it's too late. The thief has stolen one of the two sea monsters, and the other, ah, there it is again, help!" And again he vanished from the book. I went rushing out of the cottage onto the moor before I had even finished reading. Where on earth was Will? Why hadn't he woken me up? Had he jumped into the Odyssey without me? As I ran, I scoured Peter Pan for further clues, and there on page 5 Werther reappeared with a long drawn-out "Help!" followed by the sound of nightly lizard legs stomping along behind him, coming closer and closer. Then he disappeared from the book completely. Had Will already rescued him and sent the monster back to Odyssey? I spread out the stone circle, certain that when I arrived I would find an open copy of the ancient epic poem under one of the gateways. But I was wrong. There was not a single book up there, no Odyssey, no nothing. Which meant that Will was not in the book world either. Werther had been left to fight the sea monster all on his own, and I'd wasted precious time running up here. Why hadn't I gone to Werther's aid right away, straight from the cottage? I threw myself to the ground and slid Peter Pan over my face. A moment later, the letter swirled before my eyes and sucked me into the story. Will was leaning against the old hearth at McAllister Castle. His eyes were on the door that led down to the dungeons. It was open a crack. Had he and Amy not yet closed it properly the night before? He moved closer, trying to remember. But wisps of fog clouded his brain. He walked down the stairs. The fog was stopping him from thinking clearly. It was making him forget why he'd come here. He couldn't even remember how he'd got here, if he was being honest. He must have fallen asleep because he'd had a dream about home still dead and about the princess who had called out to him. Once again, anger at what the girl had done to his best friend sank its claws into him and burrowed into his guts. Had his subconscious driven him to the castle to interrogate the princess again, to force her to look him in the eye and explain herself, to get his revenge? Will reached the bottom of the staircase. Darkness surrounded him. Without his torch, he was forced to feel his way through the clammy walls with his fingers, but he didn't care. The musty breath of the dungeon filled his lungs. Anger sliced through his stomach, and he ate into his chest, its claws tearing at his ribs. Why had the princess killed Holmes? Why? What had he known that she didn't want him to know? Will stumbled through the darkness, ducking beneath the low ceilings. His fingers touched rock and metal bars. Once something hairy with too many legs went scuttling across his hand. At last he turned the final corner of the tunnel. There was only one torch left burning on the wall. Its light hurt his eyes. He wrenched it out of its bracket and spun around, directing the light toward the cell behind him. Rage was roaring in his ears now, but he rested the powerful urge to fling the flaming torch through the bars into the princess's gaunt face. Instead, he moved closer and shone the firelight into the cell. The pallet was still in place, and in the corners of the cell were the same pools of shadow as in the evening before. But the princess was gone. She was gone? Yes, gone, and the barred door stood open. Will kicked out the stone wall. How could this happen? Had somebody set the girl free, Amy? Or had she managed to escape on her own? The lock looked undamaged, as if it had been opened with a key. Will rubbed his eyes with a thumb and forefinger. At least his rage had swallowed up the fog instead. The fog in his head. If the princess had escaped, there was presumably nothing to stop her committing another theft. She might already have gone back to the book world. Werther might already have sounded the alarm. Come to think of it, why had Will let Peter Pan behind? Hadn't it been his turn to keep watch? His feet flew through the tunnel and up the stairs. He sprinted across the old kitchen, along the draughty corridors, and out of the castle gates. A few minutes later, he was back at his cottage. "Amy," he cried, hurrying inside. "You have to wake up." But Amy was gone, and so was Peter Pan. Will bit his lip and tasted blood. His eyes darted feverishly around the room for an instant, as if expecting to see Amy or the princess behind the stove or by the door. But that was ridiculous, of course. Will turned on his heel and kept running. Werther must have appeared in the book and called to them. Amy was probably in the book world right now without him. What if she needed his help? Why had he gone down to those bloody dungeons? How could he have abandoned her like that? Will headed for the portal as fast as he could. He needed to jump right away. There was still a chance he might be able to help Amy and Werther stop the princess. He climbed the hill on long strides and burst into the stone circle. It was just as he'd suspected. Peter Pan lay open under one of the gateways. Amy must have jumped in not long ago, but there was somebody else standing in the center of the porte litere. The princess laughed when she saw Will. It was not the laugh of a child, but that of a queen. On her head was the blood-red diadem. "You will come with me," she said, and extended her hand as if expecting him to kneel and kiss it. The monster was chasing Werther was the most hideous creature that I had ever seen. It looked like a sausage with scales. Unfortunately, this particular sausage was the size of a high-speed train, and the front end consisted primarily of teeth, set in jagged rows one behind the other inside of an enormous mouth. It didn't have any eyes, though, at least not that I could see. Its lizardly legs were tiny, barely capable of supporting its own weight. The creature was clearly more home in the water than on the land. Even on solid ground, however, they were far from slow. When I landed on When I landed in Peter Pan, it was in the process of chasing Werther right across Neverland and into the neighboring story. Miss Amy, panted Werther as I joined him. I am exceedingly glad to see you. Likewise, I grunted through gritted teeth. The smell of the beast's breath was making me feel sick. We had to take it back to its story. That thought had occurred to me too, but I was somewhat preoccupied with staying alive, replied Werther. The monster took a huge bound toward us and snapped at Werther's head, coming so close that its jaws closed around the velvet ribbon of his ponytail. We ducked aside, rolled down a slope, and ran on side by side, splitting up and veering off to the right and left from the time to confuse the monster. Together we reached the Odyssey and the ocean strait where the beast lived. But it showed not the slightest interest in its own story. For some reason it didn't want to go home. It was intent on eating Werther. I have an idea, cried Werther at last. We flicked ourselves through the pages of the Odyssey from one island to the next, with the monster still hot on our heels. Soon we'd lured it out of the epic poem and into the story of war and peace, to a scene between the enemy lines at the Battle of Austerlitz. Frustratingly, however, not even cannonballs seemed able to make any sort of impression on it. By this time we were completely out of breath. We'd narrowly avoided being swallowed by the monster several times, and the more exhausted we got, the more frequent these near misses became. Werther was panting so loudly that I was afraid he might faint at any moment. On a sudden impulse, therefore, as we passed a series of fairy tales, I dragged a stumbling Werther behind me into Rapunzel. We scrambled up the captive girl's braid and into our sky-high tower, and there we sat watching the monster as it circled the walls and launched itself at them with dogged persistence. Werther, still out of breath and scarlet in the face, told me in broken sentences what had happened before my arrival. The thief, it seemed, had been less purposeful this time than on the previous forays. He had been seen roaming around the Odyssey for some time, as if unsure whether or not to steal the 10th idea, but in the end he made his move and taken one of the two sea monsters. The one he'd stolen, claimed Werther, was even uglier and more terrible than the scaly sausage at the foot of the tower. Werther had tried to stop the thief and pull down his hood, but by that time the second monster had spotted him and he'd run for his life. I had no choice but to flee, Miss Amy, he explained remorsefully. I'm sorry I came too late to help you. Werther brushed my apology aside. I am the one who has failed. I had the chance to catch the thief, but I saved my own life instead because I am a coward, he sniffed. Rubbish, I said. You're one of the best and bravest friends I've ever had. Werther's face glowed an even brighter red. Miss Amy, he whispered, his hands reached for mine. I beat a hasty retreat and went to lean out of the window, where I stood watching the monster. He was making enthusiastic attempts to clamber up the side of the tower, scrabbling at the wall with its lizard legs. Might there be some kind of trick for calming it down? I wondered. Do you know much about the Odyssey? How did the characters fight the beast? Said Werther. I believe Odysseus endeavors to stay as far away from her as possible. Her, I asked. It's a girl? Werther nodded. Her name is Charybdis, and she causes deadly whirlpools. The scaly sausage name was as ugly as she was then. She's pretty deadly with or without the whirlpool, if you ask me, I said, pointing to the huge maw full of teeth and still snapping in our direction. Indeed, Werther sighed and patted the back of his head. Only now did I see that the monster had bitten off not only his velvet ribbon, but most of his ponytail as well. But she will not be able to climb up here. You should jump back to the outside world, Miss Amy, and try to stop the thief from there. Perhaps the last idea has not yet been delivered to the princess's dungeon. I knew he was right. I felt uneasy for a while now, because I was afraid something terrible was going to happen on Stormsay once the princess got hold of all 10 ideas. But what about you? I asked. I felt as though I was leaving Werther in the lurch again. Well, now I shall keep this charming young lady company, he said, smiling over at Rapunzel. She waved shyly back at him. Okay, great, I said. I'll be back as soon as I can. I tugged at the loose stone in the wall in the tower. Take care of yourself, okay? I called just before the cage collapsed on top of me. I took the shortest possible route back to Peter Pan, and from there I jumped back to Stormsay. I knew something was wrong the moment I landed. With me, I heard a high voice say, and I caught sight of the princess in the middle of the stone circle. To my left stood Will, his eyes pinned on the little girl. He looked confused, as though he were struggling to think clearly. I scrambled to my feet and took his hand. Where were you? I whispered. And why is she out of her cell? But before Will could reply, the princess laughed aloud. Wonderful, she cried. This is wonderful. Now you can both come with me. She fished a few scraps of burned paper from the depths of her gown and scattered them underneath one of the archways. Then she placed 2 shimmering spheres in their midst. The little princess flower is suspended inside one of the spheres, and the white rabbit from the Wonderland lolloped about in the other. Both of them melted away into the remnants of the manuscript. All of a sudden, several flawless pages appeared on the ground. It was just as we'd suspected. She was trying to repair her story. She had already started. My heart began to beat faster. The princess beamed. "And now come with me," she said, pointing to the new pages. Obviously, I didn't budge. She'd just implanted the rabbit and the flower into her story without batting an eyelid. And now she wanted us to go with her into her fairy tale of stolen ideas as if none of that mattered. What was she thinking? "If you think we're jumping in there with you, then that is precisely what I think," the princess broke in. Suddenly, she no longer looked like the half-starved child we'd taken her for at first. Her true age reflected in her eyes. This was no little girl standing before us, but a 500-year-old princess. I commanded. She sounded like somebody who was not accustomed to being disobeyed. Still, I shrugged. "What was she going to do? Force me to jump?" "I command it," the princess said again. She was still smiling. "And if you do not do as I say, I shall shatter these upon the rocks." She produced several more ideas from the pockets of her gown. I recognized the cyclone and Sleeping Beauty and shrank back in horror. Yes, she was going to force me, and unfortunately her arguments were pretty persuasive. "They will be irretrievably destroyed," murmured the princess. "Then your manuscript will never be more than a few scraps of paper," I stammered. "You are mistaken, Amy. The literary world has so many more ideas to steal." I stared at her. The ingredients in her skinny hands glowed softly. The cyclone, without which the Wizard of Oz had practically ceased to exist, whirled around and around inside its glass sphere. Sleeping Beauty looked so peaceful lying there asleep as her bedroom was gradually overrun by climbing roses. There was no way the princess could be allowed to destroy these stories. I squared my shoulders. "Why?" I asked as I wondered frantically what to do. My first impulse was to run at her and try to pin her down, but she would smash the ideas before I got to her. "Why what?" asked the princess. "Why should we go with you?" Out of the corner of my eye, I tried to sneak a glance at Will's face. He still looked bewildered. Would I be able to give him a signal without the princess noticing? If I distracted her, perhaps he could. "I need you for my story. It will be too empty otherwise. Now hurry up and come with me." I tried to think, but the same two ideas kept going round and round in my head. She was going to destroy the stories. We had to buy some time. "How did you escape for the dungeons?" The princess did not reply. Instead, she flashed another idea out of her pocket. The portrait of a young man floated inside the sphere, staring at us wide-eyed. It must be the picture of Dorian Gray. A moment later, the shimmering idea went hurtling through the air and shattered on one of the boulders. The crash was deafening. The man in the picture opened his mouth in astonishment, and then he was gone. Forever. I stood there as if turned to stone, unable to take my eyes off the shards of glass. She'd done it. She'd really done it. The princess was already raising the other ideas above her head, getting ready to throw them, but I still couldn't get my limbs to move. How could the broken glass on the ground look so ordinary? Nothing remained of its shimmering light. No hint of the idea at once enclosed. The princess drew back her arm and launched Sleeping Beauty through the air. It was Will who stepped in. In a heartbeat, he had thrown himself between the idea and the boulder he was about to shatter on. There was a crack as his shoulder slammed into the rock, but he managed to catch the sphere. "No!" he cried as the princess prepared to hurl the cyclone against one of the other archways. "We'll come with you." Will got to his feet and tried to pull me toward the archway where the new pages of the old legend awaited us. "We have no choice," he murmured, so quietly that only I could hear. "Just as long as the ideas still exist, there's a chance we can get them back." At last I managed to snap out of my trance. I followed him across the stone circle to the archway. Will's hand in mine was wet with sweat as we lay down. I couldn't believe we were doing this. We were about to jump into a manuscript that had been destroyed long ago, so badly that nobody could survive it anymore. This was dangerous, and it was scary, but we had no other choice. For a brief instant, Will let go of me to pick up the far too white pages, and the princess wormed her way in between us. I flinched as her skinny body touched my side. The princess smelled unwashed and strangely musky. Her dirty hair brushed my cheek. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, somebody had slid the words over my face. Words that nobody had read for a very long time. Words that began to dance before our eyes and gradually melted into one another. The fire was still burning. I smelled the flames before I saw them. The moment I was sucked inside the story, my nostrils filled with the stench of destruction, acrid, hostile. We landed in a rugged, hilly landscape that must have been drawn from the Scottish Highlands. Almost every inch of it was burning. Everywhere you looked, the flames were eating away at rock formations and lush meadows, and rocks and sheep and villages and valleys. Only the 4 or 5 pages which we stood seemed untouched by the fire. Flowers bloomed on the hilltop at our feet, and to our left loomed a castle with silver battlements and stained-glass windows. It looked ghostly against the black smoke that towered on the horizon. The princess spread her arms wide, twirled on the spot, and shouted for joy. "I have missed you, valleys," she cried. "I have dreamed of you, castle. I have returned at last. You here I've returned, and this time I will stay forever. All 3 of us will stay forever." Neither the valleys nor the castle made any reply. The only sound was the fire, spitting and crackling in the distance. It sounded like malicious laughter. As the little girl proceeded to greet the blades of grass beneath her feet and the sky overhead, parts of which were also ablaze, I seized the opportunity and launched myself at her. It was easy, ridiculously easy, in fact. The princess went down like a ninepin, the back of her head hitting the ground hard. I held her down by the shoulders with both hands, my knee on her chest. It was so much bigger and heavier than the princess. She didn't even try to push me off. Instead, she smiled. Again. Beneath the dirt on her little face, I could see freckles. Her eyes blazed, a very pale icy blue. I pressed harder into the grass. Why are you doing this? Do you know how many stories you ruined just to save this one? You've destroyed them. Yes, I know, said the princess. But this one is my home. I can't survive without it. Desmond, Glen, and Clyde began. A sneer crossed the princess's face. Desmond, Glen, and Clyde had betrayed our story. They never even tried to save it. They just surrendered willingly to their fate. They want to live in the outside world. They no longer have any right to be part of this story. I seem to recall you also spent quite a while holed up in a cave without stealing any ideas, didn't you? Why had she changed her mind all of a sudden? The princess shook her head. A thin burn scar ran all the way up her neck and disappeared somewhere behind her ear. When the accident happened, I only just managed to get out of the burning manuscript alive. Concealed by the smoke, I clung to the kilt of one of your ancestors, Amy Lennox. But I was very weak, and I dragged myself away from the people into a cave by the sea, where I fell unconscious. For many, many years, my soul drifted in the darkness, and I vowed to myself that if I did wake up, I would do whatever it took to save my story. I hoped that my loyal subjects would do the same, that perhaps they had already found a way back. And then a few weeks ago, I succeeded at last in opening my eyes. I roamed around Stormsay. I observed the inhabitants of the island and realized that Desmond, Glen, and Clyde had done nothing at all. That they were living among you, serving you even, by giving you book-jumping lessons. The princess lowered her eyelids for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was a strange glint in her eye. I could see I was going to need a new knight, she whispered. What do you mean? Her lips curled into a smile as she went on in a whisper. I needed a knight to go into the book world and steal me a metamorphosis and catch a monster for me to be afraid of. And a long sleep for that monster, of course, and beautiful flowers and summer. And a talking animal to keep me company, and evil. Evil was necessary, too. She laughed in my face so suddenly and so loud that I flinched. I had so many ideas to replace. For that I needed my knight. But, I stammered, so it was true. The princess hadn't been acting alone. Somebody must have been helping her. That was why the thief had been built like a grown man and not a child. And of course it made sense that she'd got a knight to carry out the thefts for her. In her story, she sent him out to kill the monster for her, after all. It was in her nature to get other people to solve her problems, but I swallowed hard. In the fairy tale, Desmond had been her knight. Suddenly I found it hard to breathe. Or was it just the smoke filtering into my lungs and my thoughts? The princess was still laughing, and my brain was still working overtime. I felt the cogs clicking into place one by one into my head and beginning to turn. The princess no longer saw my father as worthy of being her story. And hadn't she said something about a new knight just now? It wasn't Desmond. No, he wouldn't be able to get back into the book world any more after the princess herself. A wave of relief flooded through me, and I let out my breath, but only briefly. Who was it, then? Who, apart from us, had come into contact with the little girl? The cogs in my brain grated as they turned. They grated out a single word, a name, Brock. Brock, who had locked up the princess and given me the key. Hadn't he said something about a princess and a knight? Had she been forcing him to steal for her? Had he been trying to warn us? I shifted my weight and felt in my trouser pocket for the key to the jail cell. It was gone. My pocket was empty. Was Brock the princess's new knight? Had she ordered him to take back the key from me and set her free? Did he have to do everything There was a crash. I'd only loosened my hold of the princess for a second, but it had been enough. She managed to reach past me into the folds of her gown, pull out another ingredient, and hurl it against the wall of the castle. The glass spear shattered just like the one the princess had broken into the stone circle, but this time it was different, because now we were inside the book world, where ideas never got lost. In literature, nothing and nobody was transient. Something was rising from the shards of glass. Something grew larger by the second. At first I thought it was a little plume of smoke sleeping from between the fragments, but the plume quickly expanded, bulging outward until it was as thick as one of the castle towers, and lengthening skyward until it touched the clouds. And then it began to spin and to roar as much loudly than the fire around us. My hair whipped across my face, and wind tore fiercely at my clothes. A gust caught me and sent me stumbling a few yards backward. Away from the princess, who had now got to her feet again and was gazing at the cyclone from the Wizard of Oz with shining eyes, she clasped her hands for joy, and not a hair on her matted head stirred. I, however, was finding it hard to stay on my feet as I staggered backward into someone, who tried to hold me up. Will, he shouted something right in my ear, but I couldn't hear him. The princess's lips were moving too, as if she were speaking to the storm, as if she were giving it an order. Then she pointed suddenly in our direction, and sure enough, the cyclone was beginning to move, whirling straight toward us. Will and I ran. We sprinted down the hill, stumbling over rubble and down our own feet. And we ran, and I tugged again at the flowers and blades of grass, trying to skip to a different page. But when the page finally did start to turn, all I could see behind it was a wall of flames, fire as far as the eyes could see. This part of the manuscript had been completely destroyed. I let go of the page, and the world fell back into its place. We ran on blindly across the hillside. The cyclone was very close now. It tore at our clothes. Will and I clung to each other desperately. Somehow we made it to the other side of the hill. This time Will pulled at the stone. But we couldn't skip back a page either. The fire seemed to have eaten away the whole story. The horizon was one big sheet of flame. There was no way we would be able to escape from this book in another part of the world. We were trapped, stranded on a lone island in a fiery sea with a lunatic and a cyclone that obeyed her every command. But perhaps we could jump back to Stormsay. I dragged Will up the slope with me, back to the castle and the princess, back to the spot where we'd landed. Then the princess shouted something, and the storm surrounded us, encircled us, whirling so fast that we had to stand very still so as not to be caught up and hurled into the fire. We huddled as close together as we possibly could. The storm spiraled around us in ever tighter circles. Will's heart beat so hard that I could feel it pounding against my back. Suddenly the roaring of the wind began to subside. It was as if somebody had turned the sound off. The cyclone still whirled around us, gray and huge and savage. But all of a sudden it was completely silent. The princess moved closer to us. "See," she said, "this is my kingdom. Everything and everybody here does what I say." She sounded like a child again now, a child bragging about her ability to rage and scream until her parents did exactly what she wanted. She gave the storm a signal and began to shrink. It thinned out until it was only the width of a pencil, then folded in upon itself and rolled up into a ball. A moment later, it was a shimmering idea once more, lying in the grass. The princess stowed the glass sphere in the folds of her gown. "That was just a little taste. Now you know what I am capable of in this world, so you will listen to me more carefully from now on and do as I say." She cocked her chin. "I am going to repair the story now and then. You, Amy, my new—" "You know what? You can forget it," I hissed. The princess glared at me. "You know I can throw you into the fire whenever I want." I snorted. "Why don't you then?" I cried, thinking of the poisoned cake, the falling boulder, and the dagger attacks. "It wouldn't be the first time that you tried to kill me. I'm a bit surprised you've suddenly stopped trying, to be honest." She shrugged. "I've changed my mind. At first I did want you out of the way, it's true. I was afraid you might thwart my plans, and I didn't want to share my night. But I've changed my mind. Now I want both of you for my story." "What do you mean?" An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. "Where did that stupid rabbit go?" The princess stood on tiptoe and peered down the hill. But I was not to be deterred. "What do you mean?" I asked again. The princess sank back onto her heels. "Once the story has been repaired, you two will be the characters. Look, I'll show you." She cleared her throat. "I choose you," she announced majestically. "Kneel." I scoffed. The princess must be even crazier than I imagined if she thought we were just going to let her turn us into puppets in her fairy tale. But there was movement beside me. I only saw it out of the corner of my eye, but that was enough. I spun around. Beside me, Will had lowered himself to the ground. He was bowing his head reverently. "Stop it!" I cried, shaking him. What was wrong with him all of a sudden? "Will is never going to be your knight," I hissed at the princess. I was so angry that I spat the words at her. "Leave him alone." The princess turned to Will as if I hadn't said a word and spoke to him again. "Do you swear that you will hunt and kill the monster, that you will not rest until I, your princess, am safe once more?" "Do you swear it upon your life?" she asked in a strange sing-song voice. Then Will lifted his head and looked at her. His face lit up. He gazed raptly at the dirty little girl. "The thief, the miserable, filthy, I swear it upon my life," replied Will. He sounded oddly lifeless. "No, he doesn't," I cried, launching myself at him. I slapped him as hard as I could, first on the right cheek, then the left, and then right again, and just as I'd hoped, the veil that had fallen over his eyes lifted. He blinked and looked at me. "Amy," he whispered, "is everything okay? Did the cyclone get us?" I shook my head and pulled him to his feet. Wills looked around as if seeing the hill, the castle, and indeed the whole story we found ourselves in for the very first time. The princess grinned. "Very well," she said. "Then how about Will the monster?" Quick as a flash, she pulled two ingredients from the pocket of her gown and flung them at us. The first was the sphere containing the transformation of Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. It hit Will on the temple, where it smashed. A shimmering liquid ran down his cheek, and the second idea shattered against his chest. It was a stolen monster from the Odyssey. "No!" I screamed. The first impulse was to reach out and brush the shards of glass off Will's clothes. But desperate as I was to protect him from this lunatic, something held me back. Perhaps it was the sight of Will's face, which, from one moment to the next, had stiffened into a kind of mask. Suddenly he didn't look like himself anymore. Was it just my imagination, or were his nostrils getting wider? Will's shoulders trembled. Inch by inch, his neck grew longer. Then everything happened very fast. In the blink of an eye, his stormy blue eyes turned purple and then blazing red. His nose became a snout, and his teeth grew long and sharp. And two extra heads sprouted from the crook of his neck. I screamed. Dread coursed through my veins, ice cold. Do you know, Amy, I'm glad I didn't kill you, the princess declared, for if I had, who would my monster hunt? Every story needs a victim, somebody to terrify, somebody who dies at the end. The creature that stood before me was not Will. It was a beast the size of a house with 3 heads on 3 long necks that writhed and snaked in all directions. The monster's body was covered with spikes, its knife-sharp claws dug deep into the earth, and its 6 blazing red eyes watched me hungrily. The princess nodded to it in encouragement. It was him. It had been him all along. How could he have failed to see it? It must be a curse laid upon him when he had become the princess's knight. The curse was a terrible one. Even now he could barely fight it. Even now that he knew the truth. Even now that he knew that he himself was the monster, the knight was the monster was the knight. Had the princess known all along? 18. The night. Stop it, I screamed. Stop it. I didn't know myself whether I was talking to the monster or the princess. The monster's 3 heads dipped toward me. Strings of drool hung from their mouths. I closed my eyes like a child who thinks that if you can't see someone, they can't see you. But of course the monster would be able to eat me whether I looked it in the eye or not. I felt its hot, moist breath on my face, but still I kept my eyes closed. I didn't want to see Will like this. I stumbled backward, lost my balance on the slope, and fell. I landed roughly on my left shoulder, then I rolled down the hill a little way and hit my head on a stone and lost my bearings for a moment. The monster plunged down the hill after me. I felt a rush of air as one of its 3 heads came swooping towards me, its powerful jaws aiming straight for my heart. With the last of my strength, I flung myself aside, but I knew it was too late. There was no escape. Sharp teeth pierced my sweater. Nobody could stop the creature Will had become, except the princess. The princess laughed, and she clapped her hands. Good boy, she cried, and that's enough, and well done, and come. The teeth released their hold on me. The monster stamped its clawed feet so hard that the earth shook. But then its rasping breath quietened, and eventually fell silent altogether. When I opened my eyes, the beast was gone, and the shimmering ingredients were back in the princess's hand. Will was lying on the grass beside me. He was asleep. His nostrils had shrunk back to their normal size, and his tousled hair, as usual, was sticking up at crazy angles from his head, and it was just one head, attached to a perfectly normal neck. I bent over him and touched his cheek with trembling fingers. It felt like Will. He opened his eyes and stared at me blearily. Amy, he yawned. What happened? Did I fall asleep? I stroked his face and kissed his forehead. No, the little girl changed you. He sat up. Changed me? For a while you weren't you anymore. You were her monster. And before that, she tried to make you her knight. I didn't try to do it, whispered the princess suddenly right in my ear. I have already done it. The uneasy feeling in my stomach intensified, and a bitter taste spread across the roof of my mouth, but my brain still hadn't grasped what she meant. I was too busy spinning around to grab hold of her. I was going to grab hold of her, and I wasn't going to... But she wasn't behind me anymore. She had gone chasing off after a white shadow that was hopping through the flowers a little way, seemingly in a great hurry. Oh dear, cried the white rabbit as he glanced at his watch. I shall be late, oh dear. He ducked from under the princess's hands and went bounding off toward the castle gates. I command you to stop, panted the princess, at once. The rabbit froze mid-hop and belly flopped onto the grass. The princess picked him up and clamped him under her arm. Good boy, she had told him, in the same tone of voice that she had used to the monster a few minutes earlier. The rabbit opened his eyes wide with fear, but didn't say another word. My knees went weak as the princess turned to face us. It was easy to make Will my knight, she explained, fondling the rabbit's neck. He was trying to play dead, and I wished I could have done the same. It was far too absurd to be true. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. Instead, I felt fear clawing at my throat again, the same fear that had come crashing in on me a few days before, the morning I'd suspected Will of being the thief. I first met him 2 days before you arrived on Stormside, the princess continued as the world fell away around me. Will, the Will I had fallen in love with the thought hurt too much to think it. I stared into the rabbit's eyes, the blood roared in my ears, the fire on the horizon crackled. But still I heard the princess's words as clear as glass in my head, words like blades. Will was walking on the moor with a huge dog. I hid behind a bush, and as he came past I sprinkled my poison on him. I let it seep into his mind, and I forced him to obey me from that moment on. The next day I had him kill a couple of geese in a fairy tale, as a test. But the poison had not taken full effect, so something inside him was still rebelling, so much so that he wrote something on the wall in the dead bird's blood. As a warning to himself, or a threat to me, I don't know. But he wrote the same words on the rocks inside my cave. Perhaps he wanted to show me that I did not own him. But there, of course, he was wrong. I swallowed hard, my fear hardening into a pebble in my throat. I rumbled down through my chest and left a bloody graze on my soul. Will, I thought. Will the knight? Will the thief? Will, whom I had trusted? Slowly I turned to face him. He was still sitting beside me, still looking slightly dazed, staring into space as if he wasn't taking in a word of what the princess was saying. After that, I ordered him to steal the first idea for me. My talking rabbit here worked beautifully, and then that fool Holmes turned up. He realized at once that it was Will's own handwriting on the wall of his cottage and put two and two together and tried to help Will. We had to get rid of him, the princess sighed. Fortunately, by that time the knight was entirely obedient to me. My soul was bleeding and the loss of blood was making me dizzy. No, I whispered. Yes, said the princess. Will would never have done anything to hurt Holmes, and he helped me look for the thief. Why would he have done that if it was him all along? I don't believe you. I couldn't believe her. I wouldn't believe her. But I did believe her, and I hated her for it. The princess clamped the rabbit even more tightly under her arm and bent over Will, who still wasn't moving. She fumbled for a moment with his right boot, then pulled something out from inside it. Something silver, something with a glittering jewel-encrusted handle. The dagger shone with a ghostly gleam in the firelight. Mechanically, Will put out his hands to take it. His fingers closed around the handle as the princess leaned forward and whispered something in his ear. The white rabbit seized his opportunity while the princess was distracted to hop out of her arms and make a run for it. My feet, however, seemed to have fused with a hilltop, so that all I could do was stand there and wait and see if the princess had come up with this time, where this next whim of hers would take us, because I understood now she was playing with us and she was enjoying it. It was her story and she could do whatever she wanted. And here she controlled us all, me, the rabbit, the storm, and Will. Will the knight, who was now advancing slowly towards me. Something told me that this time she wasn't going to tell him to stop at the last moment. He was having his recurring nightmare. Holmes lay dead in his armchair and Will chased the murderer. He chased him across the island and through the bizarre landscape that seemed to be on fire at the edges. This time, though, the murderer didn't have a black cloak but a red ponytail. It was all very strange. The murderer had stopped just a few feet away from him. He was staring at Will with large shining eyes. The murderer was afraid. Will could see him trembling. It served him right. Will weighed the weapon in his hand, the weapon that was like a friend to him. The metal molded itself to his fingers. It felt good, strong, liberating. He could hardly believe it at last. The moment had come. Soon he would have his revenge. Will moved closer to the murderer, forgetting the red ponytail. The murderer's eyes, nose, and mouth blurred until he was nothing more than a shimmering silhouette, a flickering shadow who didn't deserve to live. Will thought of Holmes and raised the dagger. Then a rabbit came lolloping through his nightmare. Will blinked in surprise. For a brief moment he was distracted. The murderer, emerging from his trance, took to his heels and ran. He ran through the gates of the castle into a courtyard, skirted around a well, tried to hide behind the tendrils of a climbing rosebush, but Will would not let him escape. He ran after him, the weapon still clutched firmly in his hand. The murderer had no chance. He had run into a blind alley, and in his panic he had caught up in the thorns. Will smiled. The murderer was trying to struggle free of the thorns, but he was only succeeding in getting himself more and more tangled up in them. He was shouting, calling out things Will didn't understand. They were not important. Will was here for one reason alone. He raised his weapon again. Then he lunged, and the blade hummed through the air toward the murderer. Will closed his eyes and thought of Holmes. For you, Sherlock, he thought. But Sherlock, in his mind, shook his head and said something, a name, very short, with only a few letters long. The name felt familiar to Will. It was a name with red hair and large eyes. The blade stopped just before it reached the murderer's chest. A-M-Y, read Will from his lips. Amy, what did that mean? Good boy, whispered a voice beside him, a little girl holding a captive rabbit tightly under her arm. Do it, she whispered. Do it now. Will gripped the weapon with both hands. The tip of the blade touched the murderer, pressing against the fabric and skin and bones and a beating heart. The murderer sobbed. Tears rolled down the blurred contours of his face and dripped onto the ground. You don't know what you're doing, Will, cried the murderer. It's me. How can you not recognize me? What was he talking about? Of course Will recognized him. This was the murderer he'd been hunting for so long, wasn't it? The Holmes in Will's mind shook his head even more vehemently. Will let out a breath. This had happened before in another of his nightmares, a midsummer nightmare. He'd almost done the deed, but had faltered at the last minute. He still didn't understand why, but something had stopped him from avenging his death. It had been a strange feeling, an intuition, which he now felt creeping over him again. Do it, commanded the child beside him. Will's hands trembled. Everything in him cried out to ram the blade into the murderer's heart. It was right, he had to do it, but still he hesitated. It's me, Amy, the murderer implored. Amy. Amy, thought Will, but of course, Amy, like a cool cloth. The name slid across his eyes and wiped away the veil that had obscured them. At last he could see clearly again. At last he remembered the significance of those strange three letters. Amy. He blinked. Amy stood before him. She was tangled up in a thorny bush by the wall of the castle. There was bloody scratches on her arms. She must have been struggling frantically to get free. There were tears in her beautiful eyes. Will, she whispered. He stared at her. What has happened? You, he stammered as his eyes fell upon the dagger in his hands. A dagger? Why was he holding a dagger, and why had he been pointing at Amy? He lowered the blade. What had he done? It was as if somebody had tripped a box full of puzzle pieces into his brain, puzzle pieces made of blurred memories, puzzle pieces that showed him plundering the book world. All of a sudden he felt icy cold. You must obey me, declared the princess, folding her arms across her chest so that the rabbit was nearly crushed. You are my knight. If I tell you to kill her, you will kill her. Of course, stuttered Will, but I could see in his eyes that he had come back to me and he had finally realized. There was horror in his eyes. Good, said the princess, and she hopped up to the edge of the well and began to walk along it heel to toe. She pranced away from us, the rabbit in her arms, quietly gasping for breath. Will and I looked at each other. It was over. He was Will again, my Will. Another sob welled up in my chest. He gently loosened the thorny tendrils from around my wrists and eased me out of the bush. I wanted to fall into his arms, but he shied away from me. I understand it now, he said tonelessly, his chin quivering. He's pointing to me. What? I asked. Who? The princess was humming to herself. She still had her back to us. Will fished something out of his pocket, a crumpled sheet of paper, a letter. He unfolded it and handed it to me. It wasn't a written letter, but a drawing. A picture of the corpse surrounded by the inhabitants of the island. In the foreground stood Brock, pointing at the cluster of people as he was counting them. But when you looked more closely, you could see that Brock wasn't just pointing at random, he was pointing at Will. How could we have been so blind? How could we have failed to notice? Had Will always just thought that he was asleep when in fact he'd been out doing the princess's bidding, stealing ideas from the book world? I remembered how Werther, Shere Khan, and I had followed the thief from the Little Prince and Pride to Prejudice. Hadn't I found Will asleep at the stone circle that day? And another thing, how could I have not noticed that when Will had ever been there, not once on any of the occasions Werther and I had encountered the thief? Will appeared to be asking himself the same questions. His jaw clenched, his eyes became hard and revealed only too clearly that he was thinking of Sherlock. He had looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. I swallowed hard. You didn't know, I said. You didn't know. The princess bewitched you somehow. She poisoned you. You didn't know what you were doing, okay? Will didn't answer. Instead, he bent down suddenly and picked up an object that was lying in the grass. It must have fallen out of his pocket when he had taken out Brock's drawing. It was the key to the dungeon. I let her out, he said with an effort. I thought I was having a nightmare, but it was actually in the Odyssey, stealing a monster. And after that, I went to let the princess out of her cell. That's why I was there this morning. I let her out. He bowed his head. And Sherlock, it was me who... It was a curse. It is a curse, I murmured. The night is the monster. The princess had abused Will for her own ends, just as she had abused Desmond in a fairy tale, but she had put the same curse on Will as on Desmond, as if it was a fairy tale curse. Wasn't there some way to break it? I cast my mind around frantically, trying to remember everything I knew about the story. Who else? Desmond had told me about how it ended. At that moment, the princess glanced back over her shoulder and saw that I was still alive. Oh, my faithful knight, she cried. I wanted you to do it straight away. Do it now. My breath and my thoughts faltered. Will nodded jerkily, bent down again and picked up the dagger. Your wish is my command, he said, and stabbed the dagger into the rose bush just inches from my face. As he did so, he cut a single, particularly beautiful rose from among the thorns and handed it to me. Even as my fingers closed around it, the flower turned back into a shimmering glass sphere. It was the little prince's flower. Will smiled sadly, and then all of a sudden his face was expressionless again, his eyes blank. As if of their own accord, his hands pointed the dagger at me, but this time I wasn't tangled up in the thorns. They'd caught fire the moment Will had cut the flower from its stem, and half the castle was now burning along with the rosebush. Flames licked at the walls and windows and made the air shimmer with heat. The roaring fire gave me a few precious seconds of confusion. The princess cried out. Will's aim was so poor that I was able to dodge the dagger and duck under his arm and away. I ran, white-hot rage coursed in my veins. How could that devil child have done this to Will? With one hand I clutched the glass sphere, and with the other I lunged at the princess, trying to knock her off the wall into the well. I missed, but that didn't stop me trying a second time. Help me, my knight, you must protect me, she shrieked, dodging another of my blows and jumping down off the wall, into the cobbles of the castle courtyard. As she ran, she rummaged in the pocket of her gown for the other ideas. She was probably planning to send the monster after me again, or the evil from Wuthering Heights, but as she fought to keep hold of the violently struggling rabbit to outrun me at the same time, she was unable to find the idea she was looking for. This is my story, yelled the princess as I chased her up a spiral staircase to the top of one of the towers. Everybody here does what I want. Stop chasing me, Amy. Stop it right now. And for a moment I found myself ensnared by her words. I tasted her poison on my tongue and felt it trickle into my mind. But it was over as quickly as it had begun. You have no power over me, I shouted. I'm not your knight. We had reached the top of the tower by now, and the princess cowered against the silver battlements. I launched myself at her, wanting to claw her face to grab hold of her, and at the last moment she whirled around so that I only caught the hem of her dress. As I yanked at it, the ancient fraying fabric gave way and ripped. Then there was a clinking sound as the shimmering ideas dropped to the floor. A crack appeared in the glass sphere containing the cyclone, but miraculously it didn't break. It rolled, along with the other ideas, out of the princess's reach. So, I said quietly. The princess stared at me. Suddenly she seemed genuinely afraid of me. My knight, she screamed. Kill her! Hurry up and kill her! With pleasure, replied Will. The mechanical voice had told me he wasn't Will at all anymore. He'd followed us up the stairs and was now crossing the circular floor of the tower roof. He was still clutching the knight's dagger. He came toward us, faster now and more determined. I jumped aside, but it was too late. He had already grabbed hold of me, tugging roughly at my hair, pulling me away from the princess. Then I felt the blade at my throat cool and sharp. Will's breath came in short gasps beside my ear. I wanted to look at him, but I couldn't turn my head. Will, I whispered. Will, come back to me. It's Amy. This is not a nightmare. It's the princess's curse. The pressure of the metal on my neck grew stronger. Will, don't do this. I know you don't want to do this. No, said Will, but she's forcing me. The words sounded as if they came from very far away. You have to fight it. Do you hear me? There must be a way to break the curse. Desmond managed it anyway. The blade broke my skin. I felt a single drop of blood well from the cut and run down my neck. Desmond died at the end, muttered Will through clenched teeth. But before that he killed the monster, Will. Somehow he must have managed to break the curse. Before that, Desmond, whispered Will, and suddenly he went very quiet. The pressure of the blade on my neck eased almost imperceptibly. Amy, I think there's only one way to end this, he murmured quietly in my ear. At the end, the knight has to, he faltered. Will, I cried. You have to go, Amy, go. Take the ideas, and he broke off. Had his mind lost the battle with the poison? And what? I yelled. What do you mean? How are we supposed to get out of here while you're still under her control? This time he didn't reply. But the princess had appeared beside us and was plucking at Will's sleeve. Now, she commanded, stab her in the heart. With pleasure, said the knight, throwing me into the ground. I will put an end to this horror. He was leaning over me now. The dagger flashed before me. The fire that surrounded us was reflected in its blade, and I forgot everything, the tower, the princess, even the story we were in. All that was left was Will and me and the weapon between us. Will, I whispered, looking into his eyes one last time, eyes you could drown in, stormy blue eyes. Then at last he plunged the dagger home. The blade pierced fabric and skin and bone and flesh too easily, too fast. It pierced the beating heart. It severed muscles and arteries. It killed the heart. It was over within seconds, too quickly to take in. Will slumped to the ground. The knight closed his eyes. It was done. The curse was broken. The monster would die with him. The breath left its body. 19. The end. Will fell, and as he fell, the world slowed, stopped turning. I saw his knees give way beneath him, infinitely slowly, his body arc backward in slow motion, down and down to land softly on the roof where he'd been standing, as though an invisible current were carrying him gently to the bottom of an unknown ocean, as though it were rocking him to sleep and laying him to rest. But at last the impact did come, and the dull thought of his body hitting the stone roof ripped through the torpor of world had fallen into. It ripped through something inside me, too. Will, I heard myself shout. No. I lurched toward him. His hand still gripped the jewel-encrusted hilt of the dagger sticking out of his chest. The image was so wrong. It was impossible that the rest of the dagger was buried inside a wound that Will's eyelids fluttered as my trembling fingers touched his cheek. All of a sudden there was a lot of red. It was even reflected in his stormy blue eyes. Amy, Will whispered, the story is over. Will, I said, Will. The patch of red sped further, widening into a pool on the floor, a sea of lost life. Take the ideas and get out of here. Take them back. Will's voice grew fainter. But promise me, I promise. Amy, he smiled feebly. Now you're shining again, like a fairy, he exhaled. His lips had turned pale. The light of his stormy blue eyes went out. The night died at the end of the story. The truth gripped me, whether I wanted it or not. Will was dead. He couldn't be dead. Dead. I heard the words in my head, but I didn't understand them. Instead, I cradled Will's head in my lap and stroked his hair. What if Will had just fallen asleep? Yes, that was it. He was asleep. He was just having one of his nightmares, and this time he had taken me inside the nightmare with him. That had to be it. With my thumb, I traced the curve of his eyebrow. With my index finger, I twiddled the lock of hair behind his left ear. My vision blurred. The princess was crying, too. She crouched between the battlements and wept bitterly. Who will protect me now? She sobbed. Who will fight for me now? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her drop the rabbit to the ground and kick it. Get away from me. I want my knight. I wiped the sleeve across my face. I stroked Will's cheek one last time, then stood up. Something sticky welled from the rib inside me, thick and hot and black as pitch. It filled my chest and throbbed at my temples. He's not your knight any longer, I said. He is, the princess howled. He is. He has to protect me. She took a step toward Will's body, but I stepped forward to meet her. I would never abandon him to her. She had possessed Will for long enough. I looked around, scanning the battlements and the burning horizon. Somewhere down there, by the foot of the tower. Wasn't that where we'd entered the story? The princess glared at me. Stand aside. Forget it, I hissed, and gave a start as something suddenly bumped against my foot. The white rabbit had rolled one of the glass spheres toward me. Inside it was the rose that Will had cut from the thorns, the little princess flower. I must have dropped the idea in the chaos of the moment. I bent down to pick up as the rabbit hopped a little further away and nudged the cyclone, the monster, and Sleeping Beauty's long sleep in my direction. We must hurry, it muttered, rolling yet more ideas toward me. I nodded. Stop that, cried the princess, making a lunge for the glass spheres. But I was faster. I pulled off my sweater, gathered up the stolen ideas inside it, and knotted it so they couldn't fall out. There was only one missing, and that was the rabbit himself. He now turned back into a shimmering idea, too. As I slipped the last idea inside my sweater, the story began to fall apart. The princess cried out as the ground beneath her feet went up in flames. The tower crumbled and split in two, and she only just managed to leap across the gap to join Will and me. All that remained of the surrounding hills was engulfed by the fiery inferno, and suddenly the air around us was filled with heavy black smoke that burned my lungs, stung my eyes, and made me cough. It was as if the fire had only now become truly hot. The heat gnawed at my skin and scorched my eyeballs. The princess flung herself at me and tried to wrench the ideas out of my grasp, but she was a child. An angry, capricious, malevolent child, yes, but still far smaller and weaker than I was. I pushed her off of me, then turned back to Will and heaved his arm over my shoulder. I put one arm around his waist and held the ideas tight with the other. The princess stumbled backward, almost falling into the flames. She was beside herself with rage. She cried and yelled. She raged and stamped her dirty feet. Hatred glittered in her eyes. By the time she realized what I was planning, I had already scrambled up onto the battlements. She ran at me, trying to cling onto me the last second as she had done to one of my ancestors, but it was too late. She missed the end of my ponytail by mere millimeters, and she missed it. I'd already jumped from the tower roof. I plummeted down through the smoke and the flames and the darkness, plummeted toward the burning hilltop, and passed straight through it, back to Stormsay. The princess was left behind, a prisoner in her own story. We arrived at the stone circle, me, Will, and the glass spheres. I'd managed to save the ideas. The book world would go back almost to the way it had been before, but Will and I would not, because he still wasn't moving, and the hole in his chest was still there. I lay down beside him in the grass and closed my eyes. A river of tears had gathered behind him and now came spilling out from under my eyelids. Our shoulders touched. I felt for his hand and whirled my fingers through his. Will's skin still felt warm and alive and slightly slippery from all the blood, but it was already growing colder. His heart had stopped beating. Somewhere deep inside me, there had been a last vestige of hope. Because it had happened in the book world, and Will, after all, was a real person. I'd had this absurd idea that Dad wasn't real in books, that Will would be okay again once he was back in the outside world. That idea had been a fairy story. Will was dead. Even in the real world, he was dead. I wanted to cry until the river of tears had run dry, and the only warmth left in Will's skin was the warmth flying from my body to his, but instead I blinked and my eyes fell upon something lying on the ground close by. Will's copy of Peter Pan, his favorite story. Without stopping to think, I reached for the book and I opened it somewhere in the middle and slid it over my face. A moment later, the words sucked me in and Will along with me, his hand in mine. We landed on a break with a rotting wooden hull. It was the Jolly Roger, the scourge of the seas, the ship of the infamous Captain Hook. And the pirates, when they found us lying there on the dirty planks, realized at once that something was wrong. The plot came to a temporary halt. The pirates shed their fierce expressions and forgot for a while to be evil and bloodthirsty. Hook himself emerged from his cabin and bent over Will. He touched the wound with his hook, then took off his large plumed hat and bowed his head. He said nothing, but placed his one good hand on my shoulder. Together we stood there in silence. Somehow, though, the news of our arrival spread quickly throughout the island. Soon characters came running out of every corner of Neverland, for everybody there had known and loved Will. The Indians tiptoed onto the deck, and the Lost Boys clambered over the railing, and the mermaids began to circle the ship. Even the ticking crocodile, the one who had eaten Hook's hand and swallowed the clock, made an appearance. It dragged its scaly body toward us and rang the bell of the clock in its stomach. But Will did not wake up, and not even when the darling children, Winnie, John, and Michael, floated down from the sky along with Peter Pan himself. Peter Pan, the boy who never grew up, dropped on his knees to Will's side. What happened to him? Was he looking the wrong way? He asked. The words sounded brusque and a little arrogant, as was his way. But he was crying as he spoke. Later all I could remember was that I tried to tell them what had happened, but my account was disjointed and full of holes because I couldn't tear my gaze away from Will's staring blue eyes. Perhaps that was why I didn't notice that another character had come darting toward us, not until she landed on the end of Will's nose and pressed her ear to his lips. The fairy Tinkerbell was about the size of my hand. She listened at Will's lower lip and left traces of fairy dust on his skin. Her light flickered and her voice was like the tinkling of a bell when at last she straightened up and told us what we already knew. He's dead, she said. We nodded. Wendy sobbed. The crocodile ticked mournfully, but Tinkerbell hadn't finished. He's dead, but a trace of his soul is still inside him. Not enough for him to live, but she came buzzing over to me and whispered something in my ear. A tingling sensation flooded through me. I didn't even have to think about her offer. I nodded straight away. Tinkerbell flew straight as a die toward the wound. She flew right inside Will's chest, passing through his skin and bone and flesh and muscle. Everything she touched glittered with fairy dust, which came together to form a glittering golden cloud. And this cloud grew and spread until it encompassed Will's whole body. The fairy dust trickled to his hair, covered his face, settled in every fold of his sweater, and washed the blood away. Tinker Bell finally came to a rest on my head. She laughed her bell-like laugh, and the cloud dispersed. It happened. The thing I had no longer dared to hope for, the most incredible thing in the world, the thing that was possibly only in the book world. Will sat up. He had changed. His arms and legs were less gangling, his facial features were perfectly symmetrical, his hair was glossier, and in his stormy blue eyes were shimmering gold specks of fairy dust. He was wearing the same clothes as the Lost Boys, clothes made out of leaves and bearskins. He had become one of them. Will was a book character. But he was alive. I fell into his arms, sobbing his name and other things into the crook of his neck. I cried the river of tears now, after all, as Will held me tightly. I love you too, he said. I love you too, Amy. Then he kissed me, a long, familiar kiss. Will was himself again, my Will. The mermaids broke into song. Peter crowed like a cockerel, and pirates lit the cannons and fired several shots for sheer joy. Will and I, meanwhile, were learning how to fly. The afternoon we wandered through Neverland together, bathed in the lagoon, danced in the Indian village, and soared starward. Will belonged here now, in the book world, in this story. He was happy. He loved this book since childhood, but it still felt so strange, so final. Tinker Bell had brought Will back to life, but the magic only worked inside Peter Pan. He would have to stay here forever. He would always be 17. He would never see Stormsay again. But he was breathing. He kissed me. I lost myself in his stormy blue eyes, and he began, along with Peter and the other boys, to fight Hook. This was the price. We were happy to pay it. For a few hours I was able to stop myself thinking about what would happen next. I tried to forget what the other stories in the outside world still existed, but after a while somebody came flicking through the pages of Peter Pan toward us, somebody who, like me, did not belong there, Werther. He was riding an enormous monster that looked like a scaly sausage and looking for me. News of what had happened had spread throughout the book world, and he'd come to help me do what I had to do. The thing I'd been doggedly refusing to think about until now. He'd found me in the hut on the beach that Peter had lent us to stay in. We were in the middle of dinner when Werther burst in, lettering one of his silk stockings on the door frame. In the process, I had leaped to my feet. Werther! Miss Amy, he greeted me and made as if to kiss my hand, but I just launched myself at him and hugged him tightly. Oh, he stammered. I heard what happened. Are you well? Yes, I said, very well. Will had stood up to shook Werther's hand. They looked at each other. Werther saw what Will had become and cleared his throat. Welcome to the book world, he said politely before turning back to me. Is it true that you were able to recover the ideas? I nodded. They're out by the portal in the outside world. He looked at me. Then it is time that we returned them to their stories. Come, Miss Amy. He gave me his arm. I gazed back at him mutely. Then I turned to Will. See you later, I said, and planted a kiss on the corner of his mouth. I accompanied Werther outside the hut where Sharpdis, the scaly sausage, was gazing peacefully. She yelped for joy when she spotted Werther's ruffled shirt. It has become apparent that she thinks I am her mother, he explained sheepishly, lifting me onto the monster's back behind him. A moment later, we were speeding through the story. Werther dropped me off by the pirate ship, and I jumped back to the real world to fetch the ideas, and together we restored them to their rightful places. The talking rabbit to Alice in Wonderland, the long sleep to the Sleeping Beauty, the elf king to the elf king, the cyclone to the Wizard of Oz, the flower to the little prince, and the summer to the Midsummer Night's Dream, and the transformation to the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the evil to Wuthering Heights, and the two sea monsters to the Odyssey. The only picture from the picture of Dorian Gray was irretrievably lost, the princess having destroyed it at the stone circle. Luckily, the witches from Macbeth offered to paint a sort of mock-up of the original picture. Their picture was little more than a sketch, and it sometimes seemed as though there was black magic at work in it. But after a while, even this story began to work pretty well, so much that the readers didn't even notice the real picture was missing. In the end, almost everything was back to the way it was supposed to be, except that Will had disappeared from the outside world forever. The adult book jumpers especially missed him very much. In the weeks that followed, the Laird and Lady Mare had talked a great deal about Will and less about their ancient feud. Will's parents grieved for their son, but consoled themselves with the thought that he would live forever in the story he loved most in the world. And as for me, I traveled back and forth between the real world, which had become so much more important to me the last few weeks, and my second home, the world of stories. Almost every day I went to visit Will in Neverland. I tried not to think about what would happen in a few years' time when I would lose my gift. Nobody would predict when that would happen. I was half fictional after all. It was possible I'd be able to go on jumping for longer than other people, perhaps even forever, but it was more likely that one day I would have to decide when I wanted to spend my life. With Will in the fabulous world of words, in which everything and everyone was controlled by invisible authors, or without him in the real world, whose stories were even more exciting because they were written by life. There are cliffs in Neverland, too. They weren't as high as Shakespeare's seat, and the wind on the cliff top was only a gentle breeze. The sky was always too blue and always too sunny, but Will and I still climbed up there now and again. We closed our eyes, and as our lips touched, we remembered what it had been like the night the princess had stolen the scraps of her fairy tale, in the days when our love had still been wholly real. And then sometimes the gentle breeze became a storm after all, and carried us up, up, up into the magic of the words. The princess stood on the highest battlement of the highest tower, and looked out at the sea of flames. Stories were strange things. One minute they were over, the next minute you simply turned back to the beginning, and everything began again. One minute the princess had lost everything, the next she thought she could already spy a new knight in the distance coming to rescue her. She smiled as she waited for him. Thank you for listening to The Book Jumper by Matilda. Wait, not Matilda. Metchild Glaser. Yeah, by Mech Metchild Glaser. I hope you enjoyed it. Um, I think the next thing. So I have 8 books to read to the camera, but then I have the nonfiction books to read to live stream. So I think I'll spend some time reading to the camera before I start reading some nonfiction. But I'll read more later. Goodbye for now.